The first time I teleported, I was holding a lukewarm bag of pad thai and 40 seconds from a 1-star review. Let me set the scene because the scene is the whole joke. I'm 28. I drive for one of those courier apps, you know the ones. The logo's a little arrow that's supposed to mean fast and actually means we will pay you $4 to climb a building. I was 3 weeks behind on rent. My check engine light had become more of a check engine lifestyle, and the app had just done the thing it does where it gives you a delivery with a 7-minute timer and a destination that is physically 11 minutes away. Miss the window, lose the tip, eat the rating. The house always wins. The house is an algorithm, and it does not care that you exist. So there I am, sprinting up the wrong stairwell of a luxury apartment building, wrong because the app's pin was on the building, but the unit was through a courtyard I couldn't reach. Behind a gate I didn't have the code to, and the clock in my head was screaming, and I hit the top of the stairs and I can SCE the door. 4C right there, 40 feet away across a gap with no bridge, a decorative koi pond between me and my $4, and the timer about to flip. And I wanted, with the entire furious, exhausted core of my being, to just be over there. And then I was no flash. No noise, not really, just a hard little pop of air rushing in to fill the space where I'd stopped existing. A smell like the inside of a struck match, and a wash of heat shimmer behind me like the air over a summer road. 1 second I'm at the top of the stairs. The next I'm standing on the welcome mat of 4C with my heart trying to climb out through my teeth, and a bag of pad thai that didn't even slosh. I want to be honest about my first coherent thought, because I think it says everything about my life up to that point. My first thought was not, oh my God, the laws of physics. My first thought was, I'm gonna make the window. I rang the bell, guy answered. I handed him his noodles. He tipped me $3. I stood there in the hallway afterward shaking like a phone on vibrate, and somewhere a little chime went off that was not my phone, and a panel of soft light unrolled itself into the corner of my vision like a notification I couldn't swipe away. Delivery complete. Jobs completed. 1. It looked, I swear to you, like a delivery app. Same flat, clean design, same cheerful little font. Like whatever cosmic intern built this had ripped the UI straight from the thing already running my life. Under the counter there were 3 bars, all of them nearly empty, labeled in that same friendly type. Range, weight, volume. And a little circle in the corner, draining like a cooldown timer in a game, with the number 60 ticking down inside it. I did what anyone who has played a video game would do. I tried to read the patch notes. There weren't any. There was just the counter, and the bars, and the cooldown, and the dawning, ridiculous understanding that I had been given the single most powerful ability a human being has ever possessed. Instantaneous teleportation, the thing armies and gods and FedEx have dreamed about, and the universe had decided the way I level it up is by completing deliveries. I started laughing in that hallway, couldn't stop for a while, a power that runs on gig work. Of course it does. The one resource I have an unlimited, soul-crushing supply of. Here's the thing, though, and this is the part where the laughing stopped. I'm a guy with nothing. No savings, no leverage, no people in high places. And the very first instinct that surfaced once the shock wore off wasn't who do I tell, it was who do I not tell. Because I've watched enough of the world to know exactly what happens to a man who has something everybody wants, and no power to protect it. You don't get to keep it. You get kept. Somebody with money or guns or a badge decides you're a resource now, and resources don't have a say. The smartest thing about me, maybe the only smart thing, is that I understood in that hallway that this gift was also a target, and I zipped my mouth shut around it like a wound. So I tested it quietly. In the stairwell, where the cameras were busted, I checked. I picked a spot I could see, a landing 10 feet down, and I wanted to be there, and the air popped, and I was. Cooldown circle reset to 60. I waited it out, did it again. Same 10 feet. The range bar didn't move. The cooldown didn't shrink. Nothing leveled up. But the counter said jobs completed, 1. And the bars had moved a hair off 0. Not from teleporting, from the delivery. That was the rule then. The blink was free. The growth wasn't. I could jump around this stairwell all night like an idiot and stay exactly this week forever. The only thing that made the bars climb was finishing the job. Whoever wrote this UI had a sense of humor blacker than mine. You want range. You want to carry more. You want to be more than a man who can hop 10 feet. Then deliver, deliver and deliver and deliver. Cool, great. As it happens, delivering is the one thing I do. I took every order the app would give me that night. Didn't blink for most of them. 10 feet doesn't beat a parking lot, but I took them, all of them, sprinting and climbing and smiling into doorbell cameras, and I watched that counter climb. 2, 5, 9, and around job 9, holding a case of waters up to a third-floor walk-up, something happened that made me stop dead on the stairs. The cool-down circle, which had been a stubborn 60 all night, ticked down to 45 and stayed there. And the range bar, I felt it before I saw it, a warm little click somewhere behind my sternum, like a notch sliding into place. The range bar grew. Just a sliver, but it grew. Jobs completed, 10. Tier up range, cooldown reduced. 10 jobs, a tier. I stood on that third floor landing doing math I hadn't done since I gave up on having a future. And the math was insane, and the math was beautiful. If 10 cheap deliveries bought me a sliver of range and a faster cooldown, what did 100 buy? 1,000. How far could a man blink if he just kept finishing jobs? Across the building, across the block, I got greedy. That's the honest end of the story, the part I'm not proud of. It was almost 2 in the morning and I was high on it, and I came out of that walk-up and saw my car parked way down at the end of the long block, under the one streetlight that worked, maybe 150 feet off, and I thought, new tier. It was almost 2 in the morning and I was high on it, and I came out of that walk-up and saw my car parked way down at the end of the long block, under the one streetlight that worked, maybe 150 feet off, and I thought, new tier. Let's see what she's got. I'd seen it. That was the rule, the one I'd figured out and then ignored. You have to be able to see where you're going. I could see the car. So I wanted to be at the car, harder than I'd wanted anything since the noodles. And I pulled on whatever it is that does the pulling, reached for 150 feet on a tier that maybe had 30 in it. The pop came wrong. Too loud, more of a crack, and the match smell turned into the back of a penny on my tongue, copper and wrong, and the world didn't cut clean from here to there. It smeared. For one endless half-second, I was strung out across the whole dark block, every part of me 100 feet from every other part, and it hurt, a deep full-body wrongness like being unzipped. And then I was on someone's lawn. Not the car. A lawn maybe 60 feet short, face down in wet grass that smelled like sprinklers and dog. Warm blood sheeting out of my nose into the dirt, hands shaking so hard they wouldn't push me up. And that cheerful little panel hanging there in the dark above the grass, friendly as ever, the only light in the world, flashing one new line in a red I hadn't seen it use before. Warning, range exceeded, blink sickness. The edges of everything went soft and gray, and a silhouette stepping out onto the steps to find out why a stranger was bleeding on the grass at 2 in the morning. And me, unable to move, unable to run, unable to blink, with the biggest secret in the history of the world leaking out of my nose into somebody's lawn. And me, unable to move, unable to run, unable to blink, with the biggest secret in the history of the world leaking out of my nose into somebody's lawn. I woke up with a headache that felt like a construction crew was trying to renovate my skull using a jackhammer. My face was tacky with dried blood, and the world of the living felt distant, like I was viewing it through a dirty aquarium. The silhouette from the porch had been a guy in a bathrobe who looked more annoyed than concerned. He'd asked me what the hell I was doing on his grass, and I'd managed to stammer something about a dizzy spell and a tripped curb before I'd scrambled off his property. I didn't blink away, I couldn't. I just crawled back to my car, shaking and gray, and drove home in a fugue state, praying the nosebleed hadn't left a trail like a Hansel and Gretel breadcrumb path of hemoglobin. Once I was inside my apartment, I didn't go to bed. I sat on the floor of my kitchen, staring at the soft light of the system panel. The red warning had faded, but the lesson had sunk in. The bars aren't suggestions. They are hard walls. If you try to punch through a wall you haven't leveled, the universe punches back. I spent the next 4 hours debugging my own existence. I treated it like a patch note analysis. I started with the cooldown. I stood in the center of my living room and blinked to the couch. 10 feet, safe, boring. Pop, the circle in my vision, reset to 45. I watched it tick down, 44, 43. I realized that while the blink itself was instantaneous, the recharge was the real bottleneck. If I were in a fight or a chase, 45 seconds is an eternity. It's a lifetime. It's the difference between getting away and getting caught. Then I tested the sight anchor. I stood by the window and looked at a trash can across the alley. I could see it clearly, but it was maybe 50 feet away. I didn't pull, not yet. I just focused on the shape of it. I tried to imagine the air popping right there on the plastic lid. I felt that same tug in my chest, but it felt strained, like a rubber band stretched to the point of fraying. I didn't commit. I backed off. I realized the sight wasn't just about seeing the destination. It was about the confidence of the image. If the image was fuzzy or the distance was a guess, the blink would smear. And smearing, as I'd learned on that lawn, felt like being put through a meat grinder. Finally, I looked at the weight bar. It was the emptiest of the three, a sliver of a thing that looked like it could barely handle a sandwich. I grabbed my delivery bag, stuffed it with a few heavy textbooks I'd kept from a community college course I dropped 3 years ago, and tried a short hop. Pop. I landed on the rug, but I felt it, a heaviness. Not just the weight of the books, but a drag on the blink itself, as if I were trying to swim through molasses. I added one more book, and the pop sounded different, thicker, more labored. When I landed, my head swam for a second. I checked the bar. It hadn't moved, but I was pushing the ceiling. I was a man who could move himself and a small suitcase, and that was it. If I tried to blink while carrying a heavy-duty grocery order of 24 waters, I'd probably arrive at the customer's door as a collection of loosely associated organs. I sat back against the wall, breathing hard. The rules were simple, brutal, and completely fair in the way a casino is fair. I had a tool, but the tool was blunt. To sharpen it, I needed those numbers to go up. And the only way they went up was by doing the one thing I hated most in this world: working. The next morning, I didn't just log into the app. I went into a predatory headspace. I stopped treating the deliveries like a chore and started treating them like experience grinding in a low-level forest. I wanted that range bar to move. I wanted the cooldown to drop. I wanted to be able to cross a street without fearing for my molecular integrity. And here is the part where I learned, the hard way, what line of sight actually meant. The order was a stack of protein tubs to a 24-hour gym on 8th. Picture in my head: front desk, glass counter, the bored kid I'd seen there 100 times scrolling on his phone. I'd been in that lobby 10 times. I knew that lobby. I had the picture, the cool-down ring was empty, and the staircase up to the gym was 4 flights, and the timer was eating me. So I did the thing I'd just told myself, very specifically, not to do. I blinked from memory to a place I wasn't looking at. The pop came wrong. Smelled like a struck match, tasted like a struck face. I arrived where I'd asked the universe to put me, except the universe took me at my word and dumped me in the gym, not the lobby. Inside the gym, which, that early in the morning, meant the women's locker room. Steam, fluorescent buzz, the specific Thailand shampoo smell that should never include a man with a box of whey protein. For about 3 seconds, the entire room was statue still. Me frozen mid-step, in a hoodie holding a stack labeled Chocolate Fudge 5LB. A woman by the lockers in a towel and not much else, hand halfway to her hair. Her brain catching up. My brain quitting. She screamed. I made a sound I'm not putting on the record. The cooldown ring had ticked exactly back to 0. I blinked again, blind, anywhere, and the universe, kinder this time, because clearly it found this funny too, spat me back out on the sidewalk outside the building with the box still in my arms. My heart in my throat, and a sprinting security guard now appearing in the gym's front window, pointing very firmly in my direction. I left the tubs on a bench. The app gave the customer a refund. I gave myself a new rule in capital letters, scrawled on the dashboard in Sharpie that night so I'd never forget it. Never blink to a place you can't currently see or didn't see 10 seconds ago. Photos work, memories from last week don't. The universe doesn't update your map for you. That little incident shaved a week off my life, and probably 20 off the unfortunate woman's. It also, I noticed quietly, ticked the jobs counter by exactly 0. The bars hadn't moved. The blink had been free. Of course it had. The system didn't pay for moves. It paid for finished deliveries. I just very generously taught it that protein powder doesn't count if you flee the scene. Lesson learned. On to the next. I took the cluster strategy. I targeted the downtown core, the area where the skyscrapers are packed tight, and the delivery pins are often separated by only a few hundred feet of gridlocked traffic. Normally, this is a nightmare because of the parking. You spend 20 minutes circling the block just to find a spot that doesn't result in a $100 ticket. Not for me. I parked 3 blocks away from a massive office complex, in a legal, long-term spot where I could leave the car for hours. I took an order for a high-end sushi platter. The destination was the 12th floor of a glass tower. I didn't drive to the front. I didn't even walk to the lobby. I walked to the side of the building, found a service alley, and looked up. I couldn't see the 12th floor, obviously, but I could see a ledge, a decorative concrete lip about 15 feet up. Pop, I was on the ledge. I felt the heat shimmer behind me and the match smell in my nose. From there, I saw an open window. A cleaning crew had left a pane slid back. I didn't know if I could make the jump, but I could see the interior ledge. Pop, I was inside. I spent the next 10 minutes walking through the halls, looking like a confused ghost in a courier polo, until I hit the office door. I handed over the sushi, got a $5 tip, and felt that beautiful digital chime in the back of my skull. Delivery complete. Jobs completed, 11. I didn't stop. I took another, and another. I became a ghost in the machine. I would blink from a sidewalk to a fire escape, from a fire escape to a rooftop, from a rooftop to a balcony. I was cutting 20-minute walks down to 3 seconds. I was hitting delivery windows that should have been physically impossible. The app's algorithm probably thought I had a jetpack. By the 5th hour, I was vibrating. The adrenaline was masking the fatigue, and the constant pop, pop, pop of displaced air was becoming a rhythm. I was obsessed. I watched the counter climb. 12, 15, 19. I could feel the power shifting. It wasn't a loud change, just a subtle loosening of the tension in my chest. The cooldown was ticking down faster now, not a full tear-up yet, but the pressure of the weight was easing. I was starting to trust the blink. I was starting to feel like the city wasn't a maze of walls and traffic, but a series of connected points. Around job 22, I hit a streak. 3 orders, all in the same luxury residential block. I was moving so fast, I was practically a blur. I'd pop from the curb to the lobby, then pop again to the elevator bank, then pop one last time right onto the welcome mat of the unit. I was arrogant. I was high on the efficiency of it all. I had forgotten the most basic rule of the secret. The world is covered in eyes. I was finishing the last delivery of the streak, Unit 14B. A high-rise with a concierge who looked like he'd been carved out of a piece of granite, and a security system that probably cost more than my car. I didn't want to deal with the lobby. I didn't want to sign in. I saw a small, recessed alcove just outside the building's main entrance, a little architectural nook that was shielded from the street but completely open to the air. I figured it was a blind spot. I figured the cameras were pointed at the street and the doors, not the 3-foot gap of a decorative pillar. I wanted to be inside that alcove just for a second, so I could slip through the side door without the concierge seeing me. I pulled pop. The air displaced with a sharp metallic snap. I landed in the alcove, the heat shimmer dancing behind me for a fraction of a second. I felt the familiar rush of success, the tiny thrill of cheating the system. I stepped out of the nook and glided toward the door, my heart hammering a victory lap. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something. Mounted on the underside of the decorative pillar, barely 3 inches from where my head had been a second ago, was a tiny, wide-angle dome camera. A ring-style security lens, pointed exactly, perfectly, and with crystal-clear resolution right into the alcove. I froze. In that frame there was no walking. There was no door opening. There was just a sudden, violent vacuum of air, a shimmer of heat, and then a man appearing out of thin air, fully clothed and holding a bag of takeout, as if he'd been edited into the footage by a glitchy software program. I stared at the lens, and I knew. I didn't need the system to tell me. I had just given the world a high-definition recording of the impossible. I didn't panic, because panic is for people who have something to lose. I have a cracked phone and a landlord who considers a notice to quit a friendly greeting. But I did feel a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline that tasted like copper. I stood on that welcome mat for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of absolute, frozen silence, staring at that little blue lens, wondering if I'd just broadcast my life's end to a guy who probably buys his socks in bulk. I didn't blink back. If I'd popped out of the frame a second after popping in, the footage would look like a glitch in the Matrix, maybe a corrupted file. But if I stayed for a beat, then walked down the path normally, it just looked like I'd appeared. No, that's worse. I had to make it look human. I pivoted, walked the long way back down the stone pillars, and practically sprinted to the car, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. As I pulled away from the curb, I spent the next 10 minutes obsessing over the physics of the footage. The Ring camera is wide-angle, it's low resolution. If the homeowner wasn't looking at the live feed, he'd just see a notification. Motion detected at the front door. He'd open the clip and he'd see me, just there. No approach, no footsteps, just a sudden, jarring presence. Most people would assume the camera skipped a few seconds. They'd think the Wi-Fi lagged or the app glitched. How is he so fast? Is a much more common question than did this man just fold space-time to deliver a spicy tuna roll. I bet on the glitch. I had to bet on the glitch because the alternative was a government black site and a very uncomfortable set of electrodes. But the fear didn't go away. It just shifted. It became a new layer of the game. Now, every doorbell camera was a landmine. Every security mirror in a convenience store was a snitch. I started treating the city like a stealth mission. I'd check for lenses. I'd time my blinks to happen behind pillars or inside the blind spots of porch lights. I became a connoisseur of the unseen angle, calculating my arrival points not by where I wanted to be, but by where the cameras couldn't see me. And the weirdest thing happened. The more I hid, the more the legend grew. I didn't realize it at first, but the app has its own internal community, driver forums, group chats where we complain about the pay and the customers. I started seeing my own name pop up, not as a person, but as a metric. Someone had screenshotted my delivery times. I was hitting delivered markers seconds after the pickup confirmation for jobs that spanned 4 city blocks. The other drivers were calling me a speedrunner. They thought I'd found a hack in the app's GPS or that I was using some kind of illegal modifications on my car. I didn't correct them. I liked being a ghost. I liked the idea that I was a glitch in their world, a phantom in a faded polo who could beat the algorithm at its own game. But while the drivers were guessing, the system was counting. I hit a flow state that felt like a religious experience. I stopped seeing the city as a map of streets and traffic lights and started seeing it as a series of anchors. There's a red brick wall. There's a small gap in the hedge. There's a small ledge by the fire escape. I was grinding. I was pushing. I took every low-paying, high-effort job the app would throw at me, the ones with the steep stairs and the confusing apartment numbering, because those were the ones where a 10-foot blink felt like a cheat code. I was at job 47. It was a Tuesday, raining that kind of miserable gray drizzle that turns the city into a wet sponge. I was hauling a stack of 3 oversized parcels, each one a heavy, cardboard-wrapped beast of a thing, probably some high-end home gym equipment, up to a 4th-floor walk-up. The weight was the problem. I was touching all three boxes, hugging them to my chest, and I could feel the weight bar on the panel vibrating. It was flashing that ghostly pink again. I was right on the edge. I could feel the pressure building in my sinuses, that familiar, heavy throb that warned me I was pushing the limit of what my current tier could carry. I hit the third-floor landing and looked up. I could see the edge of the fourth-floor railing, just a few feet above me. I didn't want to climb another flight of stairs, with 60 pounds of gym gear. I wanted the cut. I gripped the boxes tighter. I focused on the landing above. I pulled, the pop didn't happen. Instead, there was a sound like a heavy cable snapping, and for a second, I felt like I was being pulled through a straw. The world blurred into a streak of gray and beige, and I felt a sudden, violent surge of heat in the center of my chest. It wasn't the unzipping pain of the lawn, it was a click, a massive, satisfying metallic clunk that echoed in my bones. I landed on the fourth floor with a thud that nearly knocked the wind out of me. The boxes didn't slip. I didn't feel the pink warning. I felt expanded. I looked at the panel. Jobs completed, 50. Tier up range. Tier up weight. The range bar didn't just move a sliver, it leaped. I could feel it. The anchor in my mind, the distance I could reach without straining, had snapped outward. Before, I was thinking in terms of feet and rooms. Now I was thinking in blocks. I looked down the hallway, through the open end door, and across the street to a parking garage 100 yards away. For the first time, that distance didn't feel like a leap of faith. It felt like a step. And the weight bars. The pink was gone. I looked at the parcels in my arms and realized they felt like they were made of styrofoam. The limit had shifted. I wasn't just a guy who could carry a bag of noodles. I was becoming a man who could move actual freight. I finished the delivery, the customer barely having time to open the door before I was already gone, popping back to the stairs in a single, effortless cut. I stood there in the rain, breathing hard, staring at the new stats. The cooldown had shrunk again, down to 30 seconds. I was evolving. The gig economy prank was turning into a superpower. I felt an intoxicating sense of scale. If 50 jobs gave me this, if I could now clear a city block in a heartbeat and carry a stack of crates without a nosebleed, then the possibilities were starting to look less like making rent and more like changing the world. I started imagining the things I could move, the places I could go. I was starting to feel like the master of the machine. But there's the thing about being a glitch. Eventually, the system tries to patch you. I spent the next few hours in a blur of efficiency, popping across the city, crushing the quota, feeling the new range like a hidden limb. I was so focused on the numbers, so high on the tier up, that I forgot the most important rule of the gig. You are always being tracked. I was sitting in my car, eating a cheap taco and watching the cool-down ring spin, when my phone buzzed. It wasn't a new order. It was a message from the dispatch office, not the automated app, but a direct ping from the human side of the operation. I opened the message. It was from a dispatcher I'd never spoken to, someone who handled the high-priority routing for my sector. Vega Marcus, we've been reviewing your telemetry for the last 48 hours. Your transit times between pickup and drop-off are physically impossible. We're seeing gaps in your GPS pings that suggest you're moving at speeds that would require a jet engine or a very fast boat. Explain yourself or we're flagging your account for fraud. I stared at the screen. The speedrunner reputation had moved from the driver forums to the people who actually held the keys. The algorithm had finally noticed that I wasn't just fast, I was impossible. And in a world where the house always wins, the house had just decided to start asking questions. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of high-voltage anxiety, waiting for the hammer to drop. I didn't stop delivering, I couldn't, but I stopped being a ghost and started being a magician. I began intentionally slowing down, adding buffer time to my routes, pretending to get lost in the suburbs, and manually delaying my delivered taps. I was trying to spoof the telemetry, trying to convince a bunch of data scientists in a corporate office that I wasn't a teleporting anomaly, just a guy who occasionally had a very efficient route. But the message from dispatch wasn't a glitch. It was a summons. The dispatch office for my sector wasn't some gleaming corporate tower. It was a repurposed auto body shop on the edge of the industrial district, smelling of burnt oil, old rubber, and desperation. I pulled my beat-up sedan into the lot, feeling like a man walking toward a gallows that had been built out of hydraulic lifts and rusted toolboxes. I expected a manager in a cheap suit. I expected a stern lecture about terms of service and fraudulent activity. Instead, I found Danny Reyes. She was leaning over the open hood of a salvaged sedan, her dark, curly hair pulled up in a high, messy bun, a smudge of grease running across her cheek like war paint. She was wearing a mechanic's jacket over a tank top, steel-toe boots that had seen a decade of hard labor, and a wrench charm necklace that clinked against her chest as she worked. She didn't look up when I walked in. She just pointed a greasy finger toward a cluttered desk in the corner of the garage. "You're the glitch," she said. Her voice was dry, a low-frequency rasp that sounded like she'd spent her morning smoking unfiltered cigarettes and arguing with engines. "The one the telemetry says is breaking the laws of physics. Sit, don't touch anything. Especially not the coffee, it's basically battery acid." I sat. I felt the system panel floating in my vision, a silent companion to my panic. I didn't tell her about the blink. I didn't tell her about the tear-ups or the cool-downs. I just sat there, feeling the weight of the secret pressing against my teeth. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, leaning back in the creaky plastic chair. "Maybe the app is just bugging out. You know how the GPS is in this city. 1 minute you're on Main, the next the app thinks you're in the middle of the river." Danny finally looked at me. Her eyes were sharp, dark, and entirely unimpressed. She didn't just look at me. She looked through me like she was trying to find the seam where I was stitched together. She walked over to the desk and slapped a tablet down in front of me. It was a heat map of my last 10 deliveries. The lines were jagged, broken. There were gaps where I had simply ceased to exist in the digital world and reappeared 3 blocks away. "I've been a dispatcher for 3 years, Marcus," she said, leaning over the desk, the smell of gasoline and peppermint clinging to her. "I know what a GPS glitch looks like. This isn't a glitch. This is a teleport, or a very small, very fast jetpack. Or maybe you've discovered a way to fold the city like a piece of origami." I felt a cold sweat break across my neck. "I'm just a driver, Danny." "Stop lying, it's boring," she snapped. "The corporate office wants to flag you. They want to ban the account and probably send a team of auditors to figure out how you're cheating the system. I'm the only reason you haven't been deactivated yet. I've been smoothing your data. I've been editing your pings, adding artificial delays, and lying to the regional manager about network congestion in your sector." I stared at her. "Why?" "Because I like things that don't make sense," she said, a small, dangerous smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "And because I'm bored out of my mind. Now, you can either keep playing the 'I'm just a guy' card until you get fired and sued, or you can tell me exactly how you're doing it. In exchange, I keep the corporate suits off your back and make sure your payouts don't get frozen." It was a classic shakedown, but it was the first time in my life someone had offered me a shield instead of a leash. I didn't give her the full truth. I'm not an idiot, but I gave her a version of it. I told her I had a trick. I told her it was a physical anomaly, something I couldn't explain or control fully, and that it had a cost. I kept the system a secret. I kept the tears to myself. I let her believe it was a weird, unstable fluke of nature, rather than a gamified progression system. She didn't buy the unstable part, but she accepted the deal. For the next week, Danny became my ghost in the machine. She became the dispatcher who cleared the path, the mechanic who knew which alleys were blind to the city's surveillance, and the only person in the world who knew that Marcus Vega was not a normal human being. Our relationship was built on a foundation of mutual suspicion and a shared love for breaking rules. We spent our breaks in the garage, her tinkering with an alternator while I told her about the weirdness of the cuts. She'd ask about the range, the weight, and the limits, and I'd dodge her questions with a dry joke or a vague answer. "You're holding out on me," she'd say, tossing a wrench onto the workbench. I can see it in your eyes. You're not just glitching, you're leveling up. I don't know what that means. I'd reply, popping a small object from one hand to the other just to watch her eyes widen. But the real test, the moment the partnership moved from professional secret to ride or die, happened on a Friday afternoon. I was on a high-priority run for a medical courier service, the kind of job that pays a premium because the cargo is literally life or death. I was carrying a specialized cooling case containing an organ for a transplant, a heart, if the label was correct, destined for the city's main surgical center. The traffic was a nightmare. A multi-car pileup on the I-95 had turned the downtown core into a parking lot. I was stuck in a gridlock of honking horns and idling engines, the temperature gauge on the cooling case starting to flicker into the yellow. The timer was screaming. If the heart warmed up, the patient died. Simple, brutal logistics. I looked at the hospital. It was maybe 6 blocks away. Through the haze of smog and the towering glass of the skyscrapers, I could see the roof of the surgical center, a distinct, white-domed structure. I couldn't blink that far. Not yet. My range had grown, but 6 blocks was a leap that would have left me smeared across a sidewalk. Then I saw the disaster. A delivery truck, one of those massive 18-wheelers, had jackknifed across the intersection just ahead of me. It had slammed into a utility pole, and the pole was coming down. It didn't just fall. It snapped, sending a cascade of sparks and live high-voltage wires raining down onto the street. People were screaming. Cars were swerving. And right in the center of the chaos, a small courier bike, one of the other guys from the app, had been pinned. The bike was crushed under the fender of the truck, and the driver was trapped, his leg pinned, while a live wire hissed and sparked just inches from his head. The crowd was frozen. The police were blocks away. The wire was dancing, waiting for something to touch it. I didn't think. I didn't calculate. I just acted. I grabbed the cooling case, hugged it to my chest, and blinked. Pop, I appeared 10 feet closer to the crash. Pop, another 10 feet. I was relay hopping, a technique I'd been practicing in secret. I wasn't taking one big leap. I was taking a dozen small ones, cutting through the air in a rhythmic staccato blur. I felt the cool-down ring spinning at a dizzying speed, the heat in my chest building with every jump. I reached the trapped driver. The wire snapped, a bolt of blue electricity leaping toward the man's chest. I didn't have time to think about the weight limit. I didn't have time to worry about the unzipping feeling. I lunged forward, gripped the man's harness, and pulled. The pop was violent. It sounded like a gunshot. I felt a searing pain in my sinuses, and a thick stream of blood erupted from my nose, splashing across the white cooling case. The weight of a full-grown man plus the medical cargo was way over my current tier. For a heartbeat, I felt the world smear. I felt my skin stretching, my vision turning a bruised, necrotic purple. But then we were out. I landed hard on the sidewalk, 20 feet away from the wreckage, the driver gasping for air, the cooling case sliding across the concrete. I lay there for a second, shaking, my nose bleeding like a faucet, the red warning flashing in my vision. Warning, weight exceeded. Blink sickness, I didn't stop, I couldn't. I grabbed the case, shoved the driver toward a gathering crowd of bystanders, and used the last of my strength to blink one final time, a desperate, straining leap that put me right at the emergency entrance of the hospital. I handed the case to a stunned nurse, my face covered in blood, my eyes bloodshot, and I vanished back into the city before anyone could ask for my name. I spent the next hour in the back of Danny's garage, leaning against a tire stack, wiping my nose with a handful of industrial paper towels. Danny was staring at me, her expression a mix of horror and genuine awe. "You saved that guy," she said quietly, "and you delivered the heart. I saw the telemetry. You were jumping, like a strobe light. I overreached," I muttered, my voice sounding thick. "I felt it." "You're a lunatic, Marcus," she said, but she reached out and squeezed my shoulder. "A complete and utter lunatic, but you're the fastest thing in this city. You're lucky I'm the one handling your data." I laughed, though it felt like my skull was vibrating. I felt the warm click in my chest again. I looked at the panel. Jobs completed, 62. Tear up, wait. I was growing. I was getting stronger. I had an ally who could hide my tracks, and a power that was starting to defy the limits of the city. For a moment, I felt invincible. I felt like I had finally beaten the house. But as I walked back to my car, I didn't notice the man standing across the street. He wasn't a driver, and he wasn't a dispatcher. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my car, and he was holding a phone, staring at a grainy, high-resolution video of a man in a faded courier polo appearing and disappearing in a blur of ozone and blood. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had just found a very valuable resource, and he was already making a phone call. The high of the strobe light save didn't last. It couldn't. In my world, every single time I felt like I was winning, the universe just started preparing a bigger hammer. I spent the next few weeks in a state of disciplined grinding. I stopped treating the power like a toy and started treating it like a career. I wasn't just doing the easy jobs. I was hunting for the ones that pushed me. I wanted the weight, the distance, the sheer logistical nightmare of a delivery that made the app's algorithm scream. I was obsessed with the bars. I wanted to see the range bar stretch until the city felt like a backyard. I wanted the weight bar to move so far that I could blink a vending machine if I felt like it. Danny was the only one who saw the toll. She'd watch me walk into the garage with a 1,000-yard stare and a faint, metallic scent clinging to my skin, and she'd just hand me a bottle of water and a pack of gauze. She didn't ask why I was pushing because she knew the answer. When you've spent your whole life being the guy the world forgets, the feeling of becoming an apex predator, even a very niche, delivery-focused one, is a drug you can't quit. Then came the call that changed the math. It wasn't a standard app ping. It was a direct request through the high-priority channel Danny had helped me carve out. It was a medical emergency, the kind that doesn't go through a dispatcher but comes from a desperate administrator at a private clinic. They had a specialized set of reagents, temperature-sensitive, time-critical chemicals needed for a rare blood-clotting disorder that had to get to a patient in the east wing of the city's largest trauma center. The catch was the timing. A massive water main had burst on the 4th Street Bridge, and the resulting chaos had turned the downtown corridor into a concrete graveyard. The ambulances were stuck. The helicopters were grounded due to a sudden, violent thunderstorm that had slammed the city into a gray, screaming blindness. The reagents had a shelf life of 20 minutes. From the clinic to the hospital in the current traffic was a 40-minute drive on a good day. Today, it was an impossibility. "You can't do this, Marcus," Danny said over the comms, her voice tight. "I'm looking at the map. The distance is nearly 3 miles. Your range isn't there. Not even close." I looked at the small, reinforced titanium canister in my hand. It was heavy, not because of its size, but because of the density of the cooling mechanism inside. It felt like a lead brick. I looked at the panel. My range bar was decent. I could clear a few blocks with a relay, but 3 miles. That was a different league. That was a distance that required a level of precision and power I hadn't touched yet. "The patient dies if this doesn't arrive," I said. "You die if you try to jump 3 miles on a tier that only does half a mile," Danny snapped. "Do the math, you idiot, you'll smear. You'll end up as a red stain on a sidewalk somewhere in the middle of the city." I looked at the canister. I thought about the people who spent their lives making decisions for me, the landlords, the app developers, the guys in the suits. For once, the decision was mine. I could be the guy who played it safe and let a stranger die, or I could be the glitch that broke the world. "I'm not jumping 3 miles, I told her. "I'm relaying. The problem with relaying is that it's not just about the distance, it's about the cooldown. To cover 3 miles, I'd need dozens of jumps. Each jump would eat seconds of my cooldown. Each jump would build heat in my chest. And with the storm raging, my sight lines were garbage. The rain was coming down in sheets of gray glass, blurring the edges of the buildings, turning the city into a smudge. I started the run, pop. The first jump was easy. I cleared the clinic's parking lot and landed on a rooftop across the street. The air popped with a violent crack, the ozone smell mixing with the sulfur of the storm. I didn't stop to breathe. I looked for the next anchor, a neon sign for a pharmacy 3 blocks down. Pop, I felt the first spike of heat. It wasn't the unzipping pain of the lawn, but a steady building pressure behind my eyes, like a migraine made of electricity. I landed on a fire escape, the metal groaning under my weight. I didn't wait for the cool-down ring to fully reset. I pulled the trigger while it was still at 10%. Pop, the world shifted. The blur was stronger this time. I felt a sharp, stinging sensation in my nostrils. I wiped my face and saw a streak of crimson on my sleeve. Blink sickness. I was pushing the cooldown too hard, forcing the power to cycle faster than the system wanted it to. I didn't care. I could see the hospital now, a distant, white monolith through the rain, maybe 2 miles away. I was halfway there, and my body was starting to rebel. Every jump felt like I was dragging my soul through a narrow pipe. My vision was beginning to fray at the edges, turning a bruised, necrotic purple. Pop. I landed in the middle of an intersection, splashing into a deep puddle. The water was freezing, but my chest was a furnace. I could feel the weight bar vibrating. The canister, which had felt light at the start, now felt like it was made of neutron star material. It was pulling me down, dragging against the blink, creating a friction in the space between here and there. Pops, I hit a rooftop. Popped a ledge, pop. The top of a bus stop. My nose was bleeding freely now, a steady drip that blurred my vision. The red warning was no longer a flicker, it was a strobe. Warning, cooldown override. Range exceeded, blink sickness critical. I was a mile away. The hospital was right there, the emergency entrance a beacon of sterile white light in the gray storm. But the gap between me and the door was a vast, empty stretch of rain-slicked asphalt and screaming sirens. I tried to relay one more time, but the pop came wrong. It didn't cut, it tore. I felt a sensation of being stretched, like a piece of taffy being pulled from both ends. For a second, I wasn't a man. I was a line of agony extending across the street. I felt the air rip. I felt a sudden, violent pressure in my lungs, as if the atmosphere had decided I no longer had permission to breathe. I slammed into the pavement of the hospital driveway with a force that shattered the concrete beneath me. I didn't land on my feet. I landed on my side, sliding across the wet asphalt, the titanium canister screeching against the ground beside me. I couldn't move. My arms were lead. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, a mile away. I lay there in the rain, my face pressed against the cold stone, watching the world spin in a slow, nauseating circle. I could see the emergency doors. They were only 20 feet away. 20 feet, the shortest jump of my life, and I couldn't even twitch a finger to trigger it. I felt the blood pooling in my throat. I felt the grayness closing in, the edges of my consciousness fraying into static. I tried to reach for the canister, to just be there to finish the job, but the system was screaming. The panel in my vision was a wall of red, the text flickering so fast it was almost illegible. Push, I told myself. Just one more. I didn't blink. I didn't jump. I simply willed the canister to move. I reached out with the last shred of my will, not to move myself, but to move the cargo. I felt a final, catastrophic snap in my chest, a feeling of something breaking, not a bone, but a limit, a seal that had been holding back a flood. The canister vanished from the pavement and reappeared with a violent crack, 10 feet closer to the door. The effort was the final straw. The world didn't just go gray, it went black. The last thing I felt was the sudden, overwhelming sensation of falling, not through space, but through a void that smelled of old pennies and burnt matches. Then the silence. I don't know how long I was out. Seconds, hours, I didn't know where I was. I woke up slowly, the first thing I noticed being the cold. Not the cold of a rainy city street, but a deep, biting, sterile chill that seemed to seep into my marrow. I tried to move my hand, and felt something hard and metallic against my palm. I opened my eyes. I wasn't at the hospital. I wasn't on the street. I was lying on a polished concrete floor in a room that looked like a high-end bunker. There were no windows. The lighting was a harsh, flickering fluorescent white that made my head throb. And there, sitting on a stainless steel table 3 feet away, was the titanium canister. I tried to sit up, but my body felt like it had been put through an industrial shredder and glued back together. I looked at the panel in my vision. The red was gone. In its place, a single golden line of text was pulsing with a slow, rhythmic light. Jobs completed, 75. Tier up range, tier up weight, tier up volume. I had done it. I had broken the cap. I had tiered up in 3 different directions at once. Then I heard the sound of a heavy steel door sliding open. I turned my head, my vision still swimming, and saw a man walking toward me. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a nurse. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked like it cost more than my entire neighborhood, and he was carrying a tablet. He didn't look at me with concern. He didn't look at me with curiosity. He looked at me the way a man looks at a piece of machinery he's just bought at an auction. "You're late, Marcus," the man said, his voice as cold and flat as the floor. "But the results are promising. Let's talk about your new contract." The man in the charcoal suit didn't get to finish his pitch. The moment he opened his mouth to talk about contracts and assets, the fog in my brain cleared enough for me to realize 2 things. 1, I was in a room with no windows and a single exit. 2, I had just tiered up in 3 different directions at once. I didn't know who this guy was, but I knew the look on his face. It was the look of a man who thought he had a leash on a dog. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a conversation. I didn't even stand up. I just looked at the steel door he'd walked through, felt the new, deeper thrum of the range bar in my chest, and pulled. Pop. I didn't just clear the room, I cleared the building. I landed in a rainy alleyway 3 blocks away, smelling of wet cardboard and old grease, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I didn't stick around to see if the suit had friends. I just ran until my lungs burned, eventually sliding into the sanctuary of Danny's garage. I spent a week recovering, but the recovery was different this time. The blink sickness had left a lingering metallic taste in my mouth, but the system had rewritten my baseline. I wasn't just a guy who could hop 10 feet or relay a few blocks. I felt expanded, like the world had shrunk and I had grown to fit it. Then I looked at my bank account. For the first time since I'd started driving for the app, the numbers weren't screaming. Between the premium medical payouts and the sheer volume of jobs I was crushing now that my range was expanded, I actually had a cushion. It wasn't buy a boat money, but it was stop eating ramen for breakfast money. I did the one thing that felt like a victory lap. I paid my rent. Not just this month's, but 3 months in advance. I remember the look on my landlord's face, a man who usually viewed me as a slightly leaking faucet he couldn't quite fix, when I handed him the digital transfer. He looked at me like I'd just confessed to a crime. "Everything okay, Marcus?" he asked, squinting. "You get a promotion." "Something like that," I said, and I actually smiled. The feeling of financial air was an intoxicant. For my entire adult life, I had been playing a game of survival where the rules were written by people who wanted me to fail. The app, the landlord, the credit scores. It was all just a series of walls designed to keep me in a very specific, very poor lane. But the blink was a cheat code, and the beauty of the system was that the more I worked, the more the walls disappeared. I stopped taking the bottom-barrel jobs. No more $4 runs to the 5th floor of a walk-up. I started filtering for the high-ticket, time-sensitive nightmares, the impossible deliveries. The ones where the client was willing to pay a massive surcharge because they needed a legal document across town in 10 minutes or a specialized part for a server that had gone dark. I wasn't just a driver anymore. I was an economic anomaly. I could take a job that should take an hour and finish it in 90 seconds. I was claiming the profit margin of a teleporting god while pretending to be a very efficient man in a faded polo. This was where Cole came in. Cole was a fellow driver, a man who treated the gig economy like a slow-motion car crash he was determined to survive. He was a heavyset, friendly guy who wore a beanie regardless of the temperature and spent most of his shifts vaping in his beat-up sedan. complaining about the algorithm's bloodlust. We'd shared a few dozen lukewarm coffees at gas stations over the last year, bonding over the shared misery of the grind. I met him at our usual spot, a greasy spoon diner that served coffee tasting like battery acid, and I decided to let him in on a sliver of the truth. Not the I can teleport truth, but the I've figured out a way to make this app pay truth. I'm telling you, man, it's about the clusters. I lied, leaning over a plate of soggy hash browns. You don't take the jobs the app gives you. You bait it. You stay in the high-density zone, you ignore the low-tip pings, and you wait for the emergency flags. Once you get the algorithm to see you as a high-reliability driver, the payouts triple. Cole looked at me, his eyes wide behind his glasses, a cloud of vape smoke swirling around his head. Marcus, I've been doing this for 5 years. There is no high-reliability tier. There's just sucker and slightly less of a sucker. Where are you getting this? Just try it, I said. I'll even show you how to spoof the GPS so you don't get flagged for idling. I didn't actually give him a teleport, but I did give him some of the routing tricks Danny and I had developed. I started tipping him off to the best spots to wait for high-value pings. Watching Cole go from desperately hoping for a $10 tip to actually buying a new set of tires was almost as satisfying as my own climb. He became my unofficial hype man, the guy who validated my efficiency to the other drivers so I didn't look like a freak. I'm telling you, Cole told a group of us at a charging station, Viga's just got a different gear. I don't know what he's eating for breakfast, but the man moves. He's like a ghost in the machine. But as the money piled up, the dream started to shift. I stopped thinking about how to survive and started thinking about how to scale. I spent a lot of time in the garage with Danny, not just hiding my data, but talking logistics. She was the one who pointed out the obvious. You're wasting your time on the app, Marcus, she said, wiping her hands on a rag as she looked at the screen of her monitor. You're using a nuclear reactor to power a toaster. Why are you still letting some corporate algorithm decide your worth? You're not a courier. You're a logistics firm of one. I can't just start a company, Danny. I don't have a license for whatever this is. Who cares about a license? She countered, her voice dry and sharp. The people who pay the real money don't want a license. They want discretion. They want things moved that cannot be tracked. No paper trail, no customs, no traffic. Just it was here and now it's there. You could build a quiet, ultra-premium operation. No app, no corporate suits. Just a private line and a price tag that makes people sweat. The idea took root in my head like a weed. A private operation. An impossible courier service. I could see it. A small, elite client list of people who needed the absolute best. And I would be the only person in the world who could provide it. I wouldn't be fighting for $4. I'd be charging 4 figures. I started testing the waters. I took a few off-book jobs, small things, a set of keys forgotten at an airport, a prototype part for a tech startup in the suburbs. I didn't use the app. I used a burner phone and cash. The feeling of a cash payment, thick and heavy in my pocket, was different from a digital deposit. It felt real. It felt like power. But the problem with becoming a ghost in the machine is that eventually the machine notices the gap. I was finishing a run, a high-end set of architectural blueprints for a firm downtown, when I felt it. It wasn't the heat of the blink or the pressure of the cool-down. It was the prickle on the back of my neck, the instinctive feeling of being watched. I didn't blink immediately. I walked to my car, keeping my pace steady, my expression neutral. I glanced in the rearview mirror. A black SUV was idling 2 blocks back. It wasn't a police cruiser, and it wasn't a corporate car. It was just there. It had followed me through 3 different turns, maintaining a precise, predatory distance. I felt a cold spike of anxiety. I'd been careful. Danny had smoothed my telemetry. I'd used buffer times. I'd played the part of the efficient driver to a T. Efficiency is a signal. If you're too fast for too long, you stop being a success story and start being a target. I got into my car and started the engine, my mind racing. I could blink away, but where? If I vanished from a parked car in broad daylight, I was just leaving a neon sign that said I am the anomaly. I had to lead them somewhere, or I had to lose them. As I pulled away from the curb, I saw the SUV shift into gear. It didn't rush. It didn't siren. It just followed, a silent, charcoal gray shadow mirroring my every move. I looked at the system panel in my vision. The bars were high, the cooldown was short, and the money was in my pocket. But as I watched that SUV in the mirror, I realized that the higher you climb, the easier you are to see from the ground. I wasn't just a delivery driver anymore. I was a resource, and someone had finally decided it was time to collect. The black SUV didn't play the game of high-speed chases. It didn't screech its tires or try to box me in. It just stayed there, a charcoal gray smudge in my rearview mirror, maintaining a distance that was mathematically precise. It was the kind of following that wasn't about stopping me. It was about documenting me. They weren't trying to arrest me. They were auditing me. I felt that familiar, cold knot of panic tightening in my gut. I'd spent months building this invisible empire, scrubbing my digital footprint and playing the role of the lucky driver. But I'd forgotten the most basic rule of the road. If you're always the first one to the finish line, people eventually stop looking at the race and start looking at the runner. I turned right onto a narrow one-way street, hoping the congestion of midday traffic would give me a window to slip away. But the SUV was a ghost. It mirrored every turn, every sudden brake, every erratic lane change. I could see the tint on the windows, deep midnight black, and I knew there was a lens behind that glass. A high-res camera, probably stabilized by a gimbal, recording every second of my movements. If they caught me blinking on tape, I wasn't just a guy with a secret anymore. I was a specimen. I needed to lose them, and I needed to do it without giving them a single frame of evidence. I couldn't just blink into an alley. If they saw my car sitting empty while I vanished into thin air, the mystery was solved. I had to make it look like I'd just disappeared into the urban noise. I started sweating, the heat shimmer of the city mixing with the adrenaline spiking in my blood. I looked at the system panel. My range bar was healthy. My cooldown was ticking down with a speed that would have made my first week self weep. But range wasn't the answer here. Raw distance is a blunt instrument. I needed a scalpel. I drove toward the garment district, a chaotic maze of loading docks, steaming vents, and towering brick warehouses. It was a place of blind corners and overlapping shadows, the kind of environment where a car can vanish if the driver knows the gaps. I spotted my opening, a narrow service alley that led into a covered parking garage, the entrance obscured by a massive, idling semi-truck that was unloading crates of fabric. The truck was a wall of white steel, blocking the line of sight from the main road to the alley's interior. I slammed on the brakes, skidded into the alley, and killed the engine. I didn't get out. I didn't blink. I sat there for 10 seconds, listening to the silence of the car and the distant thrum of the city. The SUV rolled past the mouth of the alley, slowing down. I could see the driver's side mirror tilting, trying to peer around the semi-truck to see if I'd actually turned in. They were hunting. I looked out the window. About 40 feet away, across a narrow gap of asphalt, was a stack of industrial pallets leaning against a brick wall. Between me and those pallets was a small, jagged gap, a sliver of a sight line, created by the way the semi-truck's trailer was angled. I didn't want to jump to the pallets. I wanted to jump through them. I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against the glass, focusing every ounce of my will on that tiny, sliver-thin patch of gray concrete behind the pallets. I didn't just want to be there. I wanted to occupy the exact space where the camera couldn't see me, using the pallets as a physical shield for the pop. I timed it. I waited until the SUV's nose was perfectly aligned with the edge of the truck, the moment where the driver's field of vision was most obstructed. Pop. The air cracked. The ozone smell hit me instantly, sharp and metallic. I didn't just blink. I felt the shift in the air, a sudden vacuum that pulled the scent of diesel and old rain into my lungs. I landed in a crouch behind the pallets, my boots hitting the concrete with a dull thud. I was out of the car. I was 40 feet away. To anyone looking from the street, the car was still there, idling in the alley, and the driver had simply ceased to exist. I didn't move. I stayed pressed against the brick wall, my heart hammering against my ribs, watching through the gap in the pallets. The SUV stopped. The engine idled. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He wasn't wearing a suit this time. He was in tactical gear, black cargo pants, a fitted black polo, and an earpiece that looked like it belonged in a Spec Ops movie. He didn't look panicked. He looked annoyed. He walked toward the semi-truck, his eyes scanning the alley. He reached the spot where my car was parked and peered inside. I could see him squinting through the windshield, seeing the empty driver's seat, the engine still humming, the keys still in the ignition. I held my breath, my back pressed so hard against the brick I could feel the grit of the mortar through my shirt. This was the game. He knew I was gone, but he didn't know how. He'd seen a car enter an alley and a man vanish, but without a clear shot of the blink, it was just a weird occurrence. A glitch in the surveillance. He stood there for a moment, staring at the empty seat. Then he reached up to his earpiece and spoke. I couldn't hear the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a report, a confirmation of a target. He didn't try to search the surrounding buildings. He didn't run into the alley. He just walked back to the SUV, got in, and drove away at a leisurely pace. I waited 5 full minutes before I dared to move. I didn't blink back to the car, that would be too risky. I walked the long way, sneaking through the shadows of the loading docks, circling back to my vehicle with the caution of a man who knew he was being hunted by professionals. When I finally slid back into the driver's seat and pulled out of the alley, I felt a rush of triumph that was almost dizzying. I'd won. I'd used the environment, the line of sight, and the physics of the blink to outmaneuver a professional tail. I wasn't just a delivery boy, I was a ghost. But as I drove back toward the garage, the triumph started to sour. The SUV hadn't just been a random occurrence. The way that man had looked at the empty seat, not with confusion but with a kind of grim recognition, told me that they weren't guessing. They knew what I was, or at least they had a very strong suspicion. I pulled into Danny's garage and slammed the door shut, the echo of the metal reverberating through the space. I leaned against the car, my forehead resting on the cool metal of the roof, and closed my eyes. "You look like you just saw a ghost," Danny said, stepping out from under a lift with a wrench in her hand and a smear of grease across her cheek. "I think I'm the ghost," I muttered. "Danny, someone followed me. Not a creep, not a coincidence. A pro, high-end surveillance, tactical gear, the whole 9 yards. Danny stopped mid-stride, her expression shifting from casual to sharp. She didn't ask how or where. She just looked at the car, then back at me. "Did they see you?" "I don't think so. I played a trick with the line of sight. I blinked behind some pallets while they were blocked by a semi. I think I kept the secret." "I think isn't a strategy, Marcus," she said, her voice dropping into that pragmatic, no-nonsense tone that usually grounded me. "If people like that are interested in you, it's not because you're a fast driver. They're not looking for a courier. They're looking for a miracle." I looked at the system panel. The bars were glowing, the numbers were climbing, and the money was stacking up in my account. For months, I'd been treating this like a game, a way to beat the house, to get a little bit of leverage in a world that had always kept me pinned to the floor. But the house always finds a way to collect. "Who are they?" I asked. "I don't know yet," Danny replied, "but I've been monitoring the chatter on the high-end logistics boards. There's a rumor moving through the underground, something about a zero-latency asset. Someone who can move cargo without a trail, the kind of thing that makes borders irrelevant and customs officers useless." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the garage. "They don't want to arrest you, Marcus," she continued, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "And they don't want to study you in a lab. They want to own you. Because in their world, a man who can move anything anywhere isn't a person. He's the ultimate tool." I thought about the man in the SUV. I thought about the way he'd looked at the empty seat. It wasn't a look of surprise. It was the look of a man who had finally found the piece of equipment he'd been searching for. I spent the rest of the evening in a state of vibrating tension. I couldn't stop thinking about that man's voice, the cold, clinical way he'd reported my position. I realized that my invisible empire wasn't invisible anymore. I had scaled too fast. I had become too efficient. I had optimized myself right into the crosshairs of people who didn't care about delivery quotas or rent payments. As I was preparing to head inside, my phone buzzed. It wasn't a ping from the app. It wasn't a text from Cole. It was a message from an unknown number. No names, no greeting. Just a single sentence that made the blood turn to ice in my veins. "We know how you do it, Marcus. There are people who would pay a very high price for a guy like you, and there are people who will pay even more to make sure you only work for them." The message from the unknown number sat on my screen like a live grenade. I didn't reply. I didn't block it. I just stared at it until the screen timed out and left me staring at my own tired reflection in the black glass. For a few days, I played a game of extreme caution. I stopped taking the high-ticket jobs. I went back to the low-value, boring-as-hell runs that made me blend back into the sea of thousands of other desperate guys in faded polos. I tried to shrink myself, to become a rounding error in the city's logistics, hoping that whatever shadow organization was hunting me would lose interest if the zero-latency asset suddenly started taking 20 minutes to deliver a cold brew. The system didn't care about my anxiety. The system only cared about the grind. Even while I was playing it safe, I was still completing jobs. I was still hitting the quotas, and as the counter ticked up, I felt that familiar, warm click behind my sternum. It wasn't a sliver this time. It was a surge. I woke up on a Tuesday morning and looked at the range bar, and for the first time the bar didn't just look full, it looked like it had unlocked a new color. Jobs completed, 150. Tier up range. Range expanded, cross city. I didn't test it in a stairwell this time. I didn't want to risk a nosebleed in a public place. I waited until I was in the garage, standing next to a stack of old tires, and I thought about the skyline. I didn't just think about the building across the street. I thought about the harbor, the jagged silhouette of the cranes and the gray water of the bay 6 miles away. I pictured the specific, salt-crusted concrete of Pier 14, a place I'd visited a dozen times. I pulled pop. The sound was cleaner now, less of a crack and more of a sharp, professional snap. The smell of ozone was faint, almost pleasant, like the air right before a thunderstorm. One second I was smelling grease and old rubber in the garage. The next, I was standing in a gust of freezing wind, the Atlantic Ocean screaming in my left ear and the smell of rotting fish and diesel filling my nose. I stood there for a long minute, shaking not from fear but from the sheer, intoxicating scale of it. 6 miles, in the time it takes to blink. I could cross the entire urban sprawl of this city in a handful of hops. The world hadn't just shrunk. It had become a map I could fold and crease however I wanted. That was the moment I realized that playing small was a losing strategy. If there were people out there who knew what I was, they weren't going to stop because I started delivering lukewarm lattes. They were going to keep looking until they found me. The only way to survive a predator is to become a ghost that's too expensive to catch, or to build a fortress of enough money and leverage that you can actually fight back. So I stopped hiding the efficiency. I just started hiding the method. I didn't go back to the app. I went back to the burner phone and the private clients, but I shifted the scale. I started looking for the impossible jobs, the ones that didn't just require speed, but required a defiance of geography. The first one came through a contact of a contact, a guy who specialized in high-end corporate espionage and sensitive logistics. The job was simple on paper. A physical encrypted drive needed to get from a law office in the North End to a private terminal at the airport. The catch was that the drive was being released by a court clerk at 10:00 a.m., and the plane was taking off at 10:15 a.m. In a city with mid-morning traffic, that's not a delivery. That's a hallucination. Even with a police escort and a helicopter, you're pushing it. The payout was $5,000. Cash, I took the job. I didn't use a car. I didn't even take the highway. I parked my sedan in a generic parking garage 3 blocks from the law office, walked into the building, and waited for the clerk to hand over the drive. The moment the plastic case touched my palm, I stepped into a blind spot behind a decorative potted palm in the lobby. I didn't just blink. I relayed pop. I hit a rooftop 2 miles away. The air was thin and cold, the wind whipping my hoodie against my skin. I didn't stop to look at the view. I focused on the next anchor, a water tower I could see shimmering in the distance. Pop another 3 miles. The cooldown was so short now it felt like a heartbeat. I was moving across the city in jagged, invisible leaps, a human lightning bolt cutting through the concrete. I felt the strain, a slight pressure behind my eyes, but it wasn't the blink sickness. It was just the sheer physical toll of displacing that much mass over that much distance in under 60 seconds. The final jump was the hardest. The airport terminal is a fortress of glass and steel, and I didn't have a clear sight line to the interior. I had to blink to the roof of a luggage handler's shack, then drop down and sprint the last 50 feet to the private hangar. I arrived at the terminal at 10:06 a.m. The client, a man in a suit that cost more than my car, looked at his watch, then looked at me. He looked at the drive in my hand, then looked back at the road, where the traffic was currently a dead, shimmering parking lot of idling engines and swearing drivers. "How?" he asked. His voice was flat, genuinely confused. "I know the shortcuts," I said, my voice sounding ragged to my own ears. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't care. He just handed me a thick, rubber-banded stack of hundreds and vanished into the plane. I walked back to my car in a daze. $5,000. One job, 40 minutes of my life. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, just staring at the money. I remember thinking that if I did this 10 times a month, I wouldn't just be paying rent. I'd be buying the building. I'd be buying the street. But as I drove back to the garage, the high of the money started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of dread. I was getting better, faster, and richer, but I was also leaving a trail. Not a digital one. Danny had the telemetry locked down, but a logical one. I was creating a pattern of impossible arrivals. I was becoming a legend in a world where legends are usually dissected. When I pulled into the garage, the lights were already on. Danny was standing by the workbench, but she wasn't working on a car. She had 3 different monitors lined up, and they were all filled with maps, timestamps, and a series of red and green lines that looked like a circulatory system for the city. She didn't look up when I parked. She didn't even greet me. She just pointed to the center screen. "I've been tracking your shortcuts, Marcus," she said. Her voice was quiet, devoid of its usual banter. It was the voice she used when a head gasket was blown and the engine was melted. I stepped out of the car, the $5,000 still heavy in my pocket. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't," she snapped, finally looking at me. Her eyes were sharp, exhausted, and dangerously perceptive. "I'm a dispatcher. I live in the gaps between where things are and where they are supposed to be. I've been logging your pings. I've been watching the timestamps on the jobs you're taking off book." She turned the monitor toward me. It was a map of the city, but it wasn't a map of roads. It was a map of points. Point A, North End. Point B, Airport. There was a line connecting them, and next to that line was a number, 6 minutes. "That's physically impossible," Danny said. "I don't care if you found a secret tunnel or a teleporting bicycle. You moved 6 miles in 6 minutes through mid-morning traffic. You did it 3 times last week, and twice the week before." I stayed silent. I could lie. I could tell her I had a contact in the police department, or that I was using a high-speed motorcycle in the alleys. But the look on her face told me that the efficient driver lie had finally hit its expiration date. She wasn't guessing anymore. She had the math. "The people who sent that message to your phone," she continued, her voice dropping, "they aren't looking for a fast driver. They're looking for what you've become. If I can figure this out just by looking at a map, Marcus, then they've already won. They don't need to see you blink. They just need to see the result." She stepped closer, the grease on her hands smudged against her jacket. her expression a mix of genuine concern and a terrifying kind of curiosity. "So here's how this goes," she said. "You either tell me exactly what is happening, the whole truth, no more shortcuts bullshit, or you leave this garage right now and you go find a way to disappear, because as of 10 minutes ago, the pattern is too obvious to ignore." I looked at the monitors, then back at her. I thought about the man in the SUV. I thought about the zero-latency asset. I thought about the sheer, crushing weight of the secret I'd been carrying since that first bag of pad thai. For the first time, the secret didn't feel like a shield. It felt like a cage, and Danny was the only person holding the key. I opened my mouth to speak, and for a second I wondered if this was the moment my life actually ended, or if it was the moment it finally began. I didn't give her a speech. I didn't explain the cosmic irony of a gig economy power, or the way the UI looked like a cheap delivery app. I just looked at her, looked at the monitors, and decided that the cage was getting too small to breathe in. I stepped back 5 feet, put my hands in my pockets, and focused on the space exactly 2 inches to the left of her shoulder. Pop. The air snapped, the ozone smell flared, and suddenly I was standing in her personal space, the heat shimmer still vibrating off my shoulders. I didn't smile. I just looked at her. Danny didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. She just blinked, her dark eyes darting from my face to the empty space where I'd been standing a millisecond ago. She stood perfectly still for 3 seconds. Then she leaned in, squinting at the air around me as if she could see the lingering distortion of the blink. "You're a glitch," she whispered. "You're a literal walking glitch in the physics of the city." "I'm a courier," I corrected, my voice sounding thin. "And I'm terrified that anyone who knows this is going to turn me into a piece of equipment." I expected her to look at me with greed. I expected that hunger I'd seen in the eyes of the man in the SUV, the look of someone who had found a tool they could use to break the world. But Danny didn't look at me like a tool. She looked at me like a blueprint. She stepped back, her brain already moving at a speed that made my own logistics brain feel like it was idling in a parking lot. She didn't ask why or how. She didn't care about the magic of it. She cared about the application. "Stop," she said, holding up a grease-stained hand. "Stop thinking about the people hunting you for a second. Think about the gap, the actual physical gap in the market." She turned back to her monitors, her fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up freight rates, customs delays, and high-priority shipping manifests. Right now, the fastest thing on Earth is a private jet. But a jet still has to take off. It has to land. It has to clear customs. It has to deal with tarmac delays and fuel stops. It's fast, but it's still linear. She looked at me, and for the first time I saw a spark of genuine, predatory ambition in her eyes. Not for me, but for the idea. If you can move a package from point A to point B instantaneously, you aren't just a fast driver, Marcus. You're the only person on the planet who can provide true zero-latency logistics. Not overnight, not same day, now. I leaned against the workbench watching her. "You're not going to call the people in the SUV? Those idiots are thinking small," she snapped. "They want a mule. They want a guy they can put on a leash to move contraband across a border. That's a job for a dog. I'm talking about an empire. I'm talking about the kind of leverage that makes you untouchable because you're too valuable to kill and too powerful to cage." She grabbed a marker and a piece of scrap cardboard from a box of spark plugs and started sketching. It wasn't a map, it was a business model. "We don't use the apps. We don't use the burners. We build a ghost firm," she explained, her voice gaining speed. "A boutique, ultra-premium courier service. No website, no public listing. Just a single, encrypted point of contact. We target the people who move things that cannot wait: organ transplants, prototype chips, legal documents that expire in an hour, high-end art. We charge a premium that makes $5,000 look like a tip. We don't just take the impossible jobs, we define what impossible is." I looked at the cardboard. She had written 3 words in heavy black ink: the Velocity Group. "I can't do this alone, Danny. I can blink, but I can't hide $1 million in a savings account without the IRS asking why a delivery driver is suddenly a venture capitalist. I can't track the tails. I can't find the clients. That's why I'm here, she said, finally smiling. It wasn't a soft smile. It was the look of a mechanic who had just found the exact wrench needed to take apart a stubborn engine. I do the dispatch. I scrub the telemetry. I find the holes in the surveillance. I handle the money and the masks. You just be the ghost. You move the cargo, and I make sure the world forgets you were ever there. The relief that hit me was almost physical. For months, I had been treating this power like a secret I had to guard with my life, a burden that made every street corner a potential ambush. But as I looked at Danny, I realized that the secret was only a burden if you were the only one carrying it. By letting her in, I wasn't just gaining a partner, I was gaining a shield. You're really okay with this? I asked. If this goes south, we're not just talking about losing a job. We're talking about people who make people disappear. I've been working in this garage since I was 16, Marcus. I've dealt with every kind of lowlife and high roller this city has to offer, she said, her voice softening just a fraction. Besides, I've always hated the way the world is built. I like the idea of us being the ones who can just skip over the parts we don't like. We spent the next 3 days in a fever dream of planning. We didn't take any new jobs, we just mapped the infrastructure. We set up a series of shell accounts and a secure communication line that routed through 4 different countries. We discussed the limits, the weight of the cargo, the volume of the boxes, the cooldowns. We treated the system not as a mystery, but as a set of specifications for a new piece of hardware. I felt a shift in my own head. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. It was no longer the panic of a prey animal. It was the tension of a professional. I wasn't just a guy with a glitch. I was the CEO of a company with a staff of 1 and a proprietary technology that defied the laws of the universe. As the plan solidified, I felt a restless urge to push the boundaries. I had the cross-city range, but I was still tethered to my eyes. If I couldn't see the destination, I couldn't go there. It meant I was always playing a game of hopscotch, leaping from rooftop to rooftop, always needing a visual anchor. It was efficient, but it was tedious. I started experimenting with memory. I didn't have any coordinates, in the way a computer does, no latitudes or longitudes, but I had a mental map of the garage. I knew every inch of that space. I knew the smell of the oil drains, the exact position of the lift, the way the light hit the concrete floor at 4:00 p.m. I decided to try something stupid. I stood in the center of the garage and closed my eyes. I didn't want to see where I was going. I wanted to remember where I was going. I pictured the small, cluttered office in the back of the shop, the one where Danny kept her monitors and the old coffee machine. I didn't just picture it. I tried to feel the air in that room, the hum of the electronics, the specific scent of old paper and ozone. I didn't pull. I pushed. I tried to force my consciousness into the memory of the space, treating the memory as the anchor instead of a visual line of sight. The result was not a pop. It was a scream of displaced air. The sound was deafening, a violent thump that shook the tools on the workbench and sent a wave of pressure slamming into my chest. For a fraction of a second, I felt that familiar, sickening smear, the sensation of being stretched across a distance I couldn't see. Then I arrived. But I didn't arrive in the office. I arrived halfway through the wall that separated the garage from the alley. I didn't materialize inside the wall. That would have been an instant death sentence. But I arrived so close to the surface of the brick that the displacement of air acted like a physical blow. I was slammed backward, my spine hitting the concrete floor with a bone-jarring crack. I gasped for air, my lungs feeling like they'd been flattened. I looked up and saw a jagged, spiderweb crack in the brickwork, exactly where I had attempted to land. I was staring at the wall from an inch away, the dust of pulverized mortar coating my clothes and filling my mouth. Beside me, the system panel flared in a violent, warning red. Warning, target anchor imprecise, spatial misalignment. I lay there, shaking, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had tried to blink blind, and I had nearly fused myself into the architecture of the building. The coordinate lock wasn't a feature yet. It was a dangerous, unmapped territory. Marcus, Danny's voice echoed from the other side of the wall, sounding small and distant. What the hell was that noise? Did something explode? I tried to answer, but I could only manage a ragged cough. I looked at the crack in the wall, then at the red warning on my screen. I had wanted to be a ghost, but as I lay there in the dust, I realized that when you stop following the rules of the map starts fighting back. I spent the next 2 weeks treating my brain like a piece of software that needed a patch. The wall slam had been a wake-up call. The universe doesn't do close enough. If I wanted to blink without seeing my destination, I couldn't just imagine the room, I had to map it. I had to turn a memory into a coordinate. I started small. I didn't try for the office again. Instead, I spent 4 hours a day staring at a single, rusted bolt on the far wall of the garage. I memorized the flake of paint peeling off the side. I memorized the exact angle of the shadow it cast at noon. I stared at it until the image was burned into my retinas, and then I'd turn around, close my eyes, and try to lock onto that specific point in space. Most of the time, it felt like trying to catch a soap bubble with a pair of tweezers. I'd pull and nothing would happen, or I'd feel a sickening tug in my gut that told me I was about to materialize inside a tool chest. Then, on a rainy Tuesday, something shifted. It wasn't a pull this time. It was a click. I felt a mental snap, like a camera lens finding focus, and the world simply ceased to be where I was. Pop, I was standing an inch from the bolt, the smell of ozone thick in the air, my heart hammering a victory lap. I hadn't seen the bolt. I hadn't even been looking in its direction. I had just locked it. I looked at the panel. The range bar hadn't moved, but a new icon had flickered into existence, a small, stylized crosshair next to my coordinates. Jobs completed, 210. New ability unlocked, coordinate lock. Current limit, 1 mile/5 saved anchors. I didn't just feel a surge of power, I felt a surge of liberation. The hopscotch phase of my life was over. I no longer had to climb rooftops and squint through binoculars to get across town. As long as I had been to a place once and saved the anchor, I could return to it from anywhere within a mile. I was no longer just a guy who could jump. I was a guy who could vanish and reappear in a pre-planned safe zone. That was the day I deleted the app. It was a spiritual experience. I remember the way my thumb hovered over the icon, the little arrow that had spent years telling me I was worth $4 and a 1-star review. I thought about the lukewarm pad thai and the rain-soaked stairwells, and the way the algorithm had treated me like a disposable battery. Then I pressed uninstall. The screen flickered, the app vanished, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't owe a machine my time. Official business starts now, Danny said, leaning against the workbench. She was wearing a new headset and staring at a screen that looked like a NASA mission control center. The Velocity group is live. We've got the encrypted line, the shell accounts are humming, and I've spent the last 48 hours seeding the Whisper network. We aren't advertising. We're leaking. We're letting the people who have too much money and not enough time hear that there is a ghost in the city who can move anything, anywhere, instantly. And I asked, who's biting? A few low-level sharks. Some corporate types who want to move prototypes without the risk of a courier getting intercepted. Small fry, but the margins are insane. We're charging a flat $5,000 access fee just to open an account, plus a sliding scale based on the urgency. We spent the next month in a state of high-functioning paranoia. We weren't just running a business, we were building a fortress. Danny handled the logistics with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. She didn't just find the clients, she vetted them. She ran background checks on people who didn't even have names, using tools I didn't know existed. She made sure that every delivery I made was a blind drop. I'd blink in, drop the package, and blink out before the client even knew I was there. Money started piling up in a way that felt fake. I went from counting pennies for rent to seeing balances in the shell accounts that looked like phone numbers. I bought a new car, not a flashy one, because flashy gets you noticed, but a clean, reliable black sedan that could blend into any parking lot in the state. I bought better clothes, better gear, and a level of security that allowed me to sleep for more than 4 hours at a time. But the system didn't stop. It never stops. As I completed these high-end jobs, the bars kept climbing. My weight capacity surged. I went from carrying small envelopes to hauling heavy crates of server hardware and industrial prototypes. The volume bar followed suit. I could now blink with things the size of a large refrigerator, provided I was touching them. I was becoming the ultimate logistical anomaly. I was a one-man shipping empire with zero overhead and a delivery time of 0 seconds. I felt invincible. I felt like I had finally beaten the house. Then the first real request came through. It wasn't from one of the corporate suits or the desperate prototype hunters. It came through a series of encrypted relays that made even Danny frown. The message didn't have a company name or a formal request. It was just a set of coordinates and a delivery window. "This one is different," Danny said, her voice tight. She was staring at the screen, her brow furrowed. "The routing on this is professional, like state-level professional. It didn't come through the usual channels. It bypassed 3 of my filters and landed directly in the priority queue." "What's the job?" I asked. "A single package. High priority. The payout isn't a sliding scale, it's a flat $50,000. Cash deposited into the escrow account the moment the delivery is confirmed." I paused. 50,000 for one jump. That wasn't just a premium, that was a bribe. That was the kind of money people pay when the cargo is something that doesn't officially exist, or when the delivery is so sensitive that the risk of it being intercepted is worth a fortune. "Who is it?" "That's the thing," Danny said, turning the monitor toward me. "There's no name, no company. Just a contact handle, the associate, and the pickup point is a private warehouse in the docks district. Not a law office, not a corporate HQ, a warehouse." I felt a cold prickle of intuition at the base of my neck. The zero-latency asset message from months ago flashed through my mind. I had spent all this time building a shield, thinking that money and secrecy were the same thing as safety. But I was forgetting the basic rule of the world I had come from. When you have something everyone wants, you don't just attract clients. You attract predators. "Do we take it?" I asked. Danny looked at the number on the screen. 50,000. It was a life-changing amount of money for a single blink. It was the kind of capital that could push the Velocity Group from a boutique operation into something global. "We're the Velocity Group," she said, though she sounded less sure than usual. "We define what impossible is. If we start turning down the big fish because we're scared, we're just a fancy version of the app you deleted." I looked at the coordinates. I didn't know who the associate was, and I didn't know what was in the package. But the greed was there, humming in my chest, mixing with the adrenaline. I wanted to see how far this could go. I wanted to know if I could move the world. "Lock the coordinates," I said. "I'll handle the pickup." The warehouse was a slab of corrugated steel and salt-stained concrete, tucked away in a corner of the docks where the streetlights had all been shot out. It was the kind of place where people went to lose things, or to make sure things stayed lost. I didn't drive in. I parked 3 blocks away and used a relay blink to hit the roof, then dropped down into the shadows of the loading bay. I stayed low, moving through the gloom, my senses dialed into the silence of the place. In the center of the bay, under a single buzzing fluorescent light, sat a small matte black briefcase. No one was guarding it. No one was waiting. It was just sitting there on a wooden pallet, a lonely piece of luggage in a cathedral of rust. I approached it slowly, my heart thumping. I reached out and gripped the handle. The moment the cold metal touched my palm, I felt it, not a physical weight, but a sense of importance. This wasn't a prototype chip or a legal brief. This was something heavy, not in pounds, but in consequence. I didn't wait around. I triggered my coordinate lock and vanished in a sharp, professional pop, leaving nothing behind but a faint scent of ozone and a vacuum of air. I materialized back in the garage, the briefcase still in my hand. I set it on the workbench, and as I did, the system panel flared. Not red, not green, but a steady, neutral white. Job completed, 1. Payment confirmed, $50,000. We're in, Danny whispered, staring at the bank balance on her screen. But as I looked at the briefcase, I noticed something. There was a small, handwritten note taped to the bottom of the case. I hadn't seen it in the dim light of the warehouse. I peeled it off and read the 3 words written in a precise, elegant script. A pleasure, Marcus. I froze. The air in the garage suddenly felt too thin. My name wasn't on the contract. My name wasn't in the encrypted relays. The associate didn't know who I was, until now. I stared at that note for a long time, the ink looking far too confident for my current state of mind. A pleasure, Marcus. It was a simple sentence, but in the context of my life, it was a tactical nuke. I had spent months building a ghost firm, scrubbing my digital footprint with the intensity of a man erasing a crime scene. And here was some nameless entity treating my identity like a trivia fact. "What is it?" Danny asked. She had seen my face. She knew the look, the one I get when I realize the joke is suddenly on me. I didn't say anything. I just slid the note across the workbench. She read it, and the silence that followed was the kind of silence that usually precedes a car crash. "How?" she whispered. I routed the request through 4 different proxies. I used a dead drop for the coordinates. There is no way they have your name. "Maybe they didn't need the routing," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "Maybe they were just waiting for the right person to pick up the phone." I looked at the black briefcase. For a second, I considered blinking it into the middle of the Atlantic. I really did. I wanted to just pop it out of my existence and pretend the last 10 minutes had been a fever dream. But that's not how this works. Once you're on someone's radar, especially someone who knows your name without being told, you don't get to just disappear. You're not a ghost anymore. You're a target with a delivery address. "Open it," Danny said. "No," I replied. "I'm not opening it. If it's a bomb, we're dead. If it's something worse, we're compromised. We're already compromised, Marcus. The guy knows your name. The only question left is whether he's paying us to be his favorite courier, or if he's just auditing our capabilities before he decides how to cage us." She was right, which was the worst part. Danny has this way of stripping away the denial and leaving you with the cold, hard logistics of the disaster. I reached for the latches, my hands shaking just enough that I had to grip the edges of the bench to steady myself. Click, click, I flipped the lid. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was a single, vacuum-sealed cylinder of iridescent blue glass. It looked like something out of a high-end perfume ad, or a very expensive piece of lab equipment. There was no label, no instructions. Just the cylinder, glowing with a faint, internal light that didn't seem to illuminate the briefcase so much as it sucked the light out of the room. "What is it?" Danny asked, leaning in. "I have no idea," I said. "But I have a feeling that $50,000 was a very cheap price for whatever this is." I didn't touch the cylinder. I just stared at it, and as I did, the system panel flickered. It didn't give me a job completion notification. That had already happened, but the bars shifted. Specifically, the volume bar. It didn't grow, but it pulsed. A tiny, rhythmic throb of light that matched the glow of the blue glass. It was the first time the system had reacted to cargo that wasn't currently being moved. It was like the power was recognizing something in the package. Not as a delivery, but as a catalyst. "We're not doing another one," I said, slamming the lid shut. "No more associates, no more blind drops. We go back to the corporate prototypes. We stay in the low-stakes lane until we figure out who this guy is." "You know that's not how this works," Danny said softly. "You've already accepted the contract. In this world, when you take a $50,000 check from a ghost, you don't get to quit. You just wait for the next invoice." And she was right. Because exactly 3 hours later, while I was sitting on the sofa trying to convince myself that I was still in control of my life, my phone buzzed. Not the delivery app, I'd killed that, but the encrypted line Danny had set up for the Velocity group. It wasn't a request. It was a photo. I opened the image and felt the air leave my lungs. It was a shot of my car, The clean, reliable black sedan I'd bought to blend in, parked in a lot I didn't recognize. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was the person leaning against the hood. It was a man in a pale suit, silver hair swept back, looking at the camera with an expression of mild, academic interest. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't holding a gun. He was just there, and in his hand, he was holding a small, crumpled piece of paper. I zoomed in. It was a receipt from a taco truck I'd visited 3 days ago. He didn't just know my name. He knew my lunch habits. He knew where I parked. He had effectively mapped my life while I was busy mapping the city. The message accompanying the photo was short. The blue cylinder was a test of speed. Now we test capacity. I have a shipment that requires a more robust set of dimensions. Be at the coordinates attached by midnight, or I'll start returning your belongings to you, one by one. In places you'll never find them. I showed the phone to Danny. She didn't even blink. She just looked at the man in the suit and then at me. He's not a corporate shark, she said, her voice cold. This is different. This is institutional. This is the kind of guy who doesn't hire couriers, he acquires assets. I'm not an asset, I snapped. Then stop acting like a delivery boy and start acting like the guy who can blink out of a locked room, she countered. If we ignore him, he'll just keep squeezing. If we go, we find out who he is and what he wants. We gather intel. We find the leverage. And if the capacity test involves something that kills me, then at least you'll die knowing you were the most expensive mistake in the history of logistics. I hated that she was the only one who could make a death threat sound like a viable business strategy. But I also knew that the fear was starting to taste like a challenge. I had spent my whole life being the guy the algorithm chewed up. I was tired of being the one who got eaten. I looked at the system panel. The volume bar was still pulsing, a low-frequency hum that seemed to be calling out to the blue cylinder still sitting on the workbench. It was a hunger, a weird, mechanical hunger for more. Fine, I said. We go, but we don't go in blind. Danny, I want every single scrap of data you can find on the associate. I want to know if he has a dog, a favorite brand of cufflinks, or a secret hatred for the postal service. If I'm walking into a trap, I want to know exactly what kind of bait is on the hook. The drive to the new coordinates took me to the far edge of the industrial district, a place where the warehouses were larger, the fences taller, and the security cameras actually worked. This wasn't a salt-stained dock. This was a fortress of glass and reinforced concrete. I didn't park. I didn't even slow down. I did a rolling blink from the passenger seat. Danny was driving, dropping me directly onto a landing pad on the 3rd floor of the facility. Pop. The air snapped, and I was suddenly standing in a sterile, white-walled corridor that smelled like a hospital and a mint factory. No dust, no rust. Just a terrifying amount of cleanliness. At the end of the hall, the man from the photo was waiting. Up close, he was even more unsettling. He didn't look like a gangster. He looked like a CEO of a company that sells things you can't afford to imagine. His suit was an immaculate shade of cream, and his eyes were a flat, dead gray that seemed to see right through my skin and into the circuitry of the system hanging in my vision. Marcus Vega, he said. His voice was a low, smooth purr. He didn't raise it, but it carried a weight that made the air in the hallway feel heavy. Your timing is, as always, impeccable. Who are you? I asked, keeping my feet planted, ready to blink the second things went south. Names are for people who can be sued, Marcus. You can call me Salazar. He stepped aside, gesturing to a massive, heavy-duty freight elevator behind him. The doors slid open to reveal a piece of cargo that made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't a briefcase. It wasn't a cylinder. It was a shipping crate, roughly the size of a small garden shed, constructed from a matte black alloy that seemed to absorb the fluorescent lights of the ceiling. It was bolted to a heavy pallet, and the sheer scale of it was enough to make the volume bar in my vision spike into the red. The blue cylinder was a litmus test, Salazar said, his voice devoid of emotion. I wanted to see if you could handle a high-value, low-mass object without panic. Now, I want to see what happens when we push the envelope. I want to see how much you can carry before you break. I looked at the crate. Then I looked at the system. Warning, volume exceeded. Current tier insufficient. I couldn't move it. Not as I was. If I tried to blink with that thing, I wouldn't just get a nosebleed. I'd probably leave half of my torso behind in the elevator. I can't move that, I said, trying to sound bored instead of terrified. Salazar smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the look a scientist gives a lab rat right before he introduces a new variable into the maze. I know you can't, he whispered. But I think you'll find that my incentives are far more persuasive than your current limitations. Tell me, Marcus, do you have any family, a girlfriend, a favorite mechanic who helps you hide your tracks? The world went cold. The ozone smell of the blink was suddenly replaced by the metallic taste of a panic attack. He didn't just know my name, he knew Danny. The job is simple, Salazar continued, his voice as smooth as glass. You move the crate to the coordinates I provide. You don't ask what's inside. You don't stop for a break. And if you succeed, the girl stays in her garage. If you fail, well, I imagine a woman of her talents would be very useful in a place where she can't talk to anyone. He stepped closer, the smell of expensive cologne and old power radiating off him. You have 1 hour to figure out how to make that crate fit into your world, Marcus. I suggest you start thinking about how to level up. Very, very quickly. He turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the white hallway with a black box that was too big to move, and a threat that was too real to ignore. I looked at the crate. Then I looked at the system. Jobs completed, 211. Next tier, volume 250 jobs. I was 39 deliveries short of being able to save the only person I trusted, and I was standing in the heart of a fortress with no way out but the one I had to build. Then from the crate I heard it, a muffled, rhythmic thumping, like someone was knocking on the inside of the metal. The sound was a wet, desperate kind of thumping, the sort of noise a trapped animal makes when it stopped being afraid and started being frantic. It wasn't a rhythmic knock, it was a frantic, uneven scratching against the matte black alloy of the crate. I froze. Every instinct I had, the ones that had kept me alive in the gig economy trenches and the ones that had kept me invisible since the first blink, screamed at me to get the hell out of there. This wasn't a capacity test. This was a psychological meat grinder. Salazar hadn't just given me a deadline. He'd given me a moral dilemma wrapped in a shipping container. I looked at the system panel. Jobs completed, 211. Next tier, volume 250 jobs. 39. I needed 39 completed deliveries to hit the volume tier required to move that crate. In the world of the Velocity Group, 39 high-end jobs could take weeks. In the world of Salazar's 1-hour deadline, it was a mathematical impossibility, unless I stopped thinking like a businessman and started thinking like a desperate man. I looked at the white, sterile hallway. I looked at the security cameras, sleek black domes that looked like unblinking eyes. I looked at the crate. If I blinked out now, I'd be safe for a few minutes. But Danny would be a ghost in some black site basement before I could even get the car in gear. I didn't have time for high-paying clients. I didn't have time for vetting or shell accounts or encrypted relays. I needed raw, unfiltered, high-velocity experience. I needed the kind of volume that only comes from the bottom of the barrel. I reached into my cargo joggers and pulled out my backup phone, the cheap, cracked burner I'd kept just in case I ever needed to disappear. I downloaded the app. The little arrow logo stared back at me, cheerful and predatory. It felt like a homecoming from hell. I didn't care about the $4 payouts or the 1-star reviews. I didn't care that the algorithm treated me like a disposable battery. I just needed the counter to move. I set my status to active. Within seconds, the phone buzzed. A delivery 2 blocks away. A bag of takeout. $3. I didn't even look at the map. I just grabbed the nearest object I could find. A heavy, industrial-grade fire extinguisher bolted to the wall and ripped it out of its bracket. I didn't need to deliver the extinguisher. I just needed a physical anchor to keep me from drifting. I gripped the red canister and pulled, pop. I materialized in a rainy alleyway 2 blocks from the facility. I didn't walk. I didn't run. I found the restaurant, grabbed the bag from the counter before the cook even finished the ticket and blinked to the customer's porch. Pop. Job completed. 1. I didn't wait for the tip. I didn't even ring the bell. I was already gone, the smell of ozone mixing with the scent of cheap orange chicken. I became a blur. I stopped treating the city like a map and started treating it like a buffet. I took every single order the app would throw at me, regardless of distance or destination. I was chaining blinks, using my coordinate locks to snap back to the industrial district just long enough to check the time, then launching myself back into the grid. The physical toll started hitting me around job 15. Blinking is a workout for the soul, and I was sprinting a marathon in a 100-yard dash. My vision started to fray at the edges, a soft, gray vignette closing in. My heart wasn't just hammering, it was trying to kick its way through my ribs. Every pop felt louder, the displaced air hitting me like a physical blow. By job 20, the nosebleeds started. It wasn't the full-blown blink sickness of an overreach, but it was a steady, copper-tasting leak. I was pushing my cooldown to the absolute limit, blinking the second the timer hit 0, then blinking again. I was a glitch in the system, a ghost haunting the delivery routes of the city, moving faster than the algorithm could even track. Jobs completed, 225. I was halfway there. I was standing on a rooftop in the middle of a downpour, my courier polo soaked through, blood dripping from my nostrils onto the concrete. I felt lightheaded, the world tilting on its axis, but the numbers were climbing. Job 226, Job 227, Job 228. I was starting to see double. Every time I materialized, the pop felt less like a clean cut and more like being slammed into a wall. The heat shimmer behind me was lingering longer, the ozone smell turning into something acrid, like burning plastic. I didn't stop, I couldn't. Every time I thought about the thumping inside that black crate, the adrenaline surged, overriding the exhaustion. I wasn't just delivering food and electronics. I was buying Danny's life, one $3 delivery at a time. By the time I hit job 240, I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. My skin had gone a sickly, translucent gray, and my eyes were bloodshot, the capillaries bursting from the sheer pressure of the rapid-fire transitions. I blinked back into the white hallway of Salazar's facility. I looked like a man who had been dragged through a hedge backwards and then electrocuted. I was drenched, bleeding, and vibrating with a frequency that made my teeth ache. I looked at the clock. 45 minutes had passed. I had 15 minutes left. 9 jobs to go. I didn't even go back to the city. I looked around the facility. I saw a series of internal mail slots, a stack of documents on a nearby desk, a half-finished coffee on a rolling cart. I realized the system didn't care who the delivery was for, as long as it was a completed job. I started improvising. I grabbed a stack of memos and delivered them to the office 3 floors up. I took a stray package from the mailroom and blinked it to the security desk. I was gaming the system, creating a loop of micro-deliveries within the walls of the fortress, sprinting through the corridors, popping in and out of existence like a strobe light. 245, 246, 247. The world was now a smear of gray and white. My balance was gone. I was leaning against the walls to keep from collapsing, the copper taste in my mouth becoming an overwhelming flood. 248, 249. I stood before the black crate. My vision was swimming, the edges of the room curling inward. I could hear the thumping again, slower now, more exhausted. It sounded like a heartbeat. I closed my eyes and focused on the only thing that mattered. I didn't need a delivery app for this. I just needed one last, tiny, insignificant act of logistics. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the receipt from the taco truck, the one Salazar had used to taunt me. I didn't need it, but I wanted him to have it back. I gripped the receipt, looked at the crate, and imagined the delivery. The receipt delivered to the man who took it. I didn't blink myself. I just pushed the piece of paper. It was a tiny, focused exertion, a micro-blink that cost me almost nothing. The receipt vanished from my hand and reappeared, fluttering softly, right on top of the matte black alloy of the crate. Job completed, 250. The system didn't just flicker this time, it exploded. A wave of gold light washed over my vision, a sudden, violent expansion of pressure that felt like a balloon popping inside my chest. The volume bar didn't just grow. It surged, the red warning vanishing and being replaced by a deep, steady blue. Tier up volume. Current capacity, large freight/industrial crate. Cooldown reduced. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. The blink sickness retreated, the blood in my nose drying instantly. I felt the weight of the world shift. I looked at the crate, and for the first time it didn't look like an immovable mountain. It looked like a package. I didn't waste a second. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around the cold, black metal of the crate. I didn't just touch it, I claimed it. I merged my intent with the mass of the object, feeling the volume tier lock onto the dimensions of the alloy box. I didn't have coordinates for where Salazar wanted it. He hadn't given them to me yet. But I didn't need them. I had the one coordinate that mattered most, pop. The hallway vanished. The sterile white walls and the smell of mint were replaced by the familiar, oily scent of grease and old tires. I materialized in the center of the garage, the black crate slamming onto the concrete floor with a bone-shaking thud. The impact sent a cloud of dust swirling around us. Marcus, Danny screamed, jumping up from her chair. She looked at the crate, then at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. You actually did it. She stopped. The thumping had started again, and this time it wasn't just a sound. The matte black alloy of the crate was vibrating. A seam appeared along the top edge, a hiss of pressurized air escaping like a dying gasp. The lid didn't slide open. It blew off, propelled by an internal spring mechanism. I stepped back, my heart hammering, expecting a bomb, a monster, or some high-tech nightmare. Instead, as the smoke cleared, a hand reached out from the darkness of the crate. It was a thin, trembling hand, the skin pale and coated in a fine, iridescent blue powder, the same color as the cylinder from the first job. And then a voice came out of the box. It wasn't a scream or a plea. It was a whisper, dry and rattling, sounding like someone who had been speaking through a mouthful of sand for a very long time. Is he still in the room? I looked around the garage. We were alone. But as I looked back at the person in the crate, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The person wasn't looking at me. They were looking past me, toward the corner of the garage, where a small, blinking red light had just appeared on the wall. A camera. And from the speakers in the ceiling, speakers I didn't even know we had, came the smooth, effortless purr of Salazar. Well done, Marcus. You've proven you can learn. Now let's discuss the price of the guest I've just delivered to your doorstep. I didn't look at the camera. I didn't give Salazar the satisfaction of knowing I was listening. My entire world had shrunk down to the thin, shaking hand and the iridescent blue powder coating the skin. Get back, I told Danny, my voice sounding like I'd swallowed a handful of gravel. I stepped forward, reaching into the crate. The person inside was a woman. She looked like she'd been put through a centrifuge and then dried in a kiln. Her skin was a ghostly, translucent pale, and her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and swimming with a terror so deep it felt like a physical weight in the room. She was wearing a white linen suit that had been shredded into rags, and the blue powder, that shimmering, metallic dust, was everywhere, clinging to her hair, her clothes, and the creases of her skin like a second, alien layer of makeup. As I gripped her arm to pull her out, a jolt of static electricity snapped between us, a sharp crack that made the system panel in my vision glitch. For a split second, the volume bar didn't just pulse. It flickered, shifting from blue to a violent, searing violet. "Who are you?" I asked, hauling her onto the concrete floor. She didn't answer. She just kept staring at that red light on the wall, her breathing coming in shallow, ragged hitches. She looked at me, but it was like she was looking through me, searching for something behind my shoulder. The price? Salazar's voice drifted from the ceiling, sounding amused. I believe we were discussing the price, Marcus. You've just completed a delivery of a most delicate nature. The guest in your garage is Alina. She is a woman of immense value, and more importantly, she is a woman who possesses a very specific set of keys. Keys to what? I snapped, finally looking up at the camera. To the things I want, Salazar replied, and the things you, in your infinite ambition, will eventually need. Alina is not a prisoner in the traditional sense. She is a vault, but vaults require a certain logistical expertise to open. Expertise that you have just demonstrated by breaking your own limits to bring her home. Danny stepped up beside me, her eyes scanning Alina with a mechanic's precision. She didn't see a victim, she saw a puzzle. You didn't just deliver her, Danny whispered, her voice tight. You used her as a weight test. He wanted to see if he could handle the volume tier and the psychic stress of a living cargo. Precisely, Salazar purred. Now here is the arrangement. Alina remains in your care. Feed her, clothe her, keep her hidden. In exchange, I will stop returning your belongings to you in random locations. I will stop auditing your associates, and in return, when I require a specific key from her, you will deliver her to me for a brief consultation. A simple back and forth. A shuttle service for the elite. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. He wasn't just hiring me. He was turning my garage into a holding cell. He was making me the jailer of a woman who looked like she'd been broken into 1,000 pieces. No, I said. Get out of my speakers. A bold response, Salazar said. But let's be practical, Marcus. Look at her. Look at the dust on her skin. Do you really think she's just a guest? That powder is a marker. It's a beacon. If you try to move her too far, if you try to hide her in a way I can't track, the reaction will be volatile. She is a biological bomb with a very short fuse, and you are the only man in this city who can move her without triggering the blast. I looked back at Alina. She had finally stopped staring at the camera. She was looking at me now, and for the first time I saw a spark of something in those bloodshot eyes. Not gratitude, not relief. It was a desperate, flickering hope, as if she'd spent the last month in a void and I was the first solid thing she'd touched. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and gripped the sleeve of my courier polo. He doesn't have the sequence, she whispered. Her voice was a ghost, a thin ribbon of sound that barely reached me. He can move the vault, but he can't open the door. What sequence? I asked. The one that tells him where the rest of it is, she said. She coughed, and a small cloud of that iridescent blue powder puffed out of her lungs, shimmering in the dim light of the garage. He thinks you're a tool, Marcus. He thinks you're a delivery boy who got lucky with a glitch. I am a delivery boy, I said. She managed a small, harrowing smile. That's why you're the only one who can kill him. You're the only one who knows how to follow the route. Before I could ask what the hell that meant, the speakers cut out. The red light on the wall went dark. The silence that rushed back into the garage was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sound of the rain hitting the corrugated metal roof. Danny knelt beside Alina, her expression grim. We can't keep her here. If he can see into the garage, he can see everything. We're compromised, Marcus. This isn't a business deal, it's a leash. I know, I said. I looked at the system panel. The volume bar was still that weird, shimmering violet. It wasn't just a tear up. It was something else. The system was reacting to Alina. Not to her mass, but to her. I looked at the woman on my floor, coated in blue dust and shaking with a terror I couldn't imagine, and I realized that Salazar hadn't just given me a job. He'd given me a map. The keys Alina possessed weren't physical. They were coordinates. Or maybe they were something more. If Salazar wanted her, and if he was willing to use her as a pawn to control me, then she was the only piece of leverage I had in a game where I was currently the smallest chip on the table. Can you move? I asked her, offering my hand. She took it. Her grip was surprisingly strong, a sudden, desperate clench that nearly pulled me off balance. As she stood, the blue powder on her skin seemed to pulse, a faint, rhythmic light that matched the beating of my own heart. I can't go back, she whispered. If I go back, you'll find the archive. The archive, Danny repeated, looking at me. Marcus, tell me we're not getting into whatever an archive is. We're already in it, I said. I looked at the black crate, still sitting in the middle of the shop. It was empty now, just a piece of high-tech scrap, but it represented a threshold I'd crossed. I wasn't just moving parcels anymore. I was moving people. I was moving secrets. And the more I moved, the more the system grew. I felt a sudden, sharp itch behind my sternum, the same feeling I'd had during my first tear-up. I checked the panel. The job's completed counter was still at 250, but a new notification was scrolling across the bottom of the UI, in a font that looked less like a delivery app and more like a military briefing. Sensitive cargo detected. Biometric sync initiated. New objective, secure the archive. What is it? Danny asked, seeing my face. The system just gave me a quest, I said, and the word felt ridiculous even as it left my mouth. And for the first time, it didn't ask me to deliver a bag of Thai food. I looked at Alina. She wasn't just a guest, she was a catalyst. And if Salazar thought he could use her to leash me, he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of a man who has spent his entire life fighting an algorithm. You don't leash a courier. You just give him a destination he can't refuse. Danny, pack the gear, I said, my voice hardening. The encrypted lines, the burners, the portable chargers. Everything, we're leaving the garage. Where are we going? I looked at Alina, and for a second I didn't see the woman. I saw a coordinate, a shimmering, distant point in space that I couldn't quite reach yet, but that I could feel pulling at the edges of my range. Somewhere Salazar can't find us, I said. And somewhere we can figure out what the hell is in that archive before the blue powder on her skin decides to blow us all to hell. I reached for the black crate, and with a single, effortless flick of my will, I blinked it out of existence. No struggle, no strain. Just a clean pop and a void where the metal had been. I felt the rush of power, the sheer, intoxicating efficiency of the new tier. For a moment, I felt invincible. I felt like the house finally belonged to me. And then, as I turned to lead Alina and Danny toward the car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It wasn't a message. It was a GPS alert. Someone had just pinged my exact location. Not from a satellite, and not from a cell tower. The ping was coming from inside the garage. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, and saw a small silver device, no bigger than a coin, stuck to the underside of the workbench. It was pulsing with a faint, iridescent blue light. The blue powder hadn't just been a marker on Alina. It had been a breadcrumb. And the breadcrumb was currently screaming my coordinates directly to the man in the cream-colored suit. I stared at that silver coin of a tracker, and for a second, I actually felt a surge of professional respect. Salazar wasn't just a logistics boss. He was a guy who understood the fundamental rule of the universe. Never trust a man who can disappear. If you can't see the asset, you put a leash on the asset's favorite shoes. In this case, the shoes were my garage, and the leash was a piece of iridescent jewelry glued to my workbench. Danny, I said, my voice flat. Don't look at the tracker. Just get in the car. What is that thing? She asked, leaning in with that mechanic's curiosity that usually gets people killed in movies. It's a one-way ticket to a very unpleasant conversation, I replied, and it's currently telling Salazar that we're standing exactly where he wants us to be. I didn't try to peel the device off. I didn't try to smash it. I've spent enough time around electronics to know that some things are designed to scream louder the moment you try to shut them up. Besides, I was currently vibrating with a new kind of energy, that shimmering violet volume tier, and I had a feeling that trying to be subtle was no longer an option. I looked at Alina. She was shivering, the blue powder on her skin casting a dim, ghostly glow against the concrete. She looked less like a vault, and more like a piece of wet parchment that would dissolve if I breathed on it too hard. Can you hold on to me? I asked. She didn't answer with words. She just gripped my forearm with a strength that felt like a vice, her fingers digging into the fabric of my polo. I grabbed Danny's jacket with my other hand, pulling her in close. The problem was the range. I could blink across town, sure, but I was carrying 2 people and a whole lot of trauma, and the breadcrumb was still actively transmitting. If I just jumped a few blocks, Salazar would just follow the ping and find us in a different alleyway. To actually lose him, I needed to break the line. I needed to put enough distance or noise between us and that tracker that the signal would blur. I closed my eyes and searched for a coordinate. I didn't have a photo of a safe house or a GPS pin for a bunker. All I had was the memory of a place I'd visited 3 months ago, a derelict warehouse on the edge of the docks, a place where the salt air eats the steel, and the city's surveillance grid is a joke because the power cables were stolen in the 90s. All I had was the memory of a place I'd visited 3 months ago, a derelict warehouse on the edge of the docks, a place where the salt air eats the steel, and the city's surveillance grid is a joke because the power cables were stolen in the 90s. I could see it. I could smell the brine and the rotting timber. I could feel the drafty, cavernous emptiness of the loading bay. I pulled. The pop this time wasn't a pop. It was a thunderclap. Because I was moving more mass than I ever had, 2 adult humans and the residual psychic weight of whatever biometric sync the system was currently running. The transition felt like being shoved through a keyhole while someone played a drum kit on my spine. The heat shimmer didn't just linger. It roared, a wall of distorted air that slammed into us the moment we materialized. We hit the warehouse floor in a tangle of limbs and iridescent dust. I landed hard on my shoulder, the impact echoing through the empty space. Elena let out a sharp, ragged gasp, her grip on my arm finally loosening as we slid across the grit-covered concrete. I scrambled up, my head spinning. The system panel flickered in my peripheral vision, the violet bar pulsing like a neon sign in a rainstorm. Sensitive cargo transported. Sync progress, 14%. Are you okay? I gasped, checking Danny. She was sprawled out, blinking rapidly, looking like she'd just been through a tumble dryer on high heat. I hate the fast way, she groaned, pushing herself up. Seriously, Marcus, the nausea is getting worse. We need to find a way to stabilize this, or one of us is going to leave a kidney behind during the next jump. I didn't have time to tell her that kidneys were a luxury we couldn't afford right now. I looked at Elena. She was curled in a fetal position, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The blue powder was reacting to the environment, swirling around her skin in slow, hypnotic patterns, like ink dropped into water. He knows, she whispered, the breadcrumb. It doesn't just track location. It tracks the event. I froze. What does that mean? The blink, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. Every time you jump with me, the signal spikes. It's not a steady ping. It's a flare. You didn't just move us. You told him exactly how much power you're starting to have. I sat back on my heels, the coldness of the warehouse floor seeping through my joggers. I'd spent months treating this power like a secret weapon, a way to cheat the system and get ahead of the grind. But as I looked at the shimmering violet bar in my vision, I realized I wasn't the one doing the cheating anymore. I was the one being played. Salazar hadn't just given me a guest. He'd given me a catalyst that was rewriting the rules of my power while simultaneously broadcasting my progress to the only man who knew how to exploit it. I was leveling up in real time, and the guy holding the leash was just watching the stats climb, waiting for me to become the perfect tool. We need to get that powder off her, Danny said, standing up and dusting off her jacket. She walked over to Elena, her eyes narrowing. If it's a beacon, we need to shield it. I've got some conductive foil and a few signal-dampening blankets in the car. Well, the car is still at the garage, but I've got a kit in my bag. Do it, I said, fast. As Danny started working, wrapping Elena in layers of metallic fabric and heavy-duty insulating wrap, I walked to the edge of the loading bay and looked out at the harbor. The sky was a bruised purple, the city skyline shimmering in the distance. I felt a strange, humming tension in my chest, a feeling that the sync the system mentioned was doing more than just tracking. I could feel Elena. Not her thoughts, not her memories, but a sort of spatial awareness. It was like my range had suddenly expanded, but not in a straight line. I could feel folds in the distance, invisible creases in the map of the city that I hadn't known existed. The system hadn't just given me more volume, it was teaching me how to see the world as a courier. not as a series of addresses, but as a series of shortcuts. Sensitive cargo sync, 22%. New ability unlocked, spatial echo. A new prompt appeared, a small, translucent button that looked like a refresh icon on a web browser. I didn't know what a spatial echo was, but given the current company, I figured any new tool was better than no tool. I tapped the icon. Suddenly, the warehouse wasn't just a warehouse. I saw a ghost image of the room, a shimmering overlay that showed me exactly where I had been and where I had come from. It was a trail of heat shimmers, a series of pops that looked like frozen explosions in the air. And then I saw it, a second echo. It wasn't mine. It was a faint, jagged ripple in the air, coming from the far end of the warehouse, near the rusted remains of an old conveyor belt. It was a distortion, a smear in space, that looked exactly like the blink sickness I'd felt when I tried to overreach my range. Someone else had jumped here, and they hadn't jumped with a system. They had jumped raw, leaving a scar on the air that was still bleeding ozone. I didn't even have time to warn Danny. From the shadows of the conveyor belt, a figure stepped out. He wasn't wearing a cream-colored suit. He was wearing tactical gear that looked like it had been designed by a paranoid government agency, all matte black plates and reinforced webbing. He didn't have a gun in his hand, but he had a device strapped to his wrist that was pulsing with the same iridescent blue light as the powder on Alina's skin. He didn't speak. He didn't introduce himself. He just looked at me with eyes that were completely, terrifyingly void of color, white pupils, white irises, like he'd been bleached from the inside out. "The asset," the man said, his voice sounding like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together. "And the mules." I stepped in front of Alina and Danny, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Who the hell are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he tapped the device on his wrist. The air around him didn't pop, it tore. There was no sound, just a sudden, violent vacuum that sucked the air out of my lungs. In a heartbeat, he wasn't 10 feet away. He was an inch from my face, his hand closing around my throat with a grip that felt like a hydraulic press. He didn't try to kill me. He didn't even try to knock me out. He just leaned in, his colorless eyes boring into mine, and whispered a single word that made the system panel in my vision turn a screaming blood red. "Overdue." And then, before I could even think to blink, the device on his wrist flared, and the world didn't just smear, it inverted. I felt a sensation of being turned inside out, a crushing pressure that felt like the entire weight of the city was collapsing onto a single point in my chest. I saw Danny scream, saw Alina's wrapped form sliding across the floor, and then I saw the warehouse vanish. I wasn't in the harbor anymore. I wasn't in the city. I was standing in a room that was perfectly white, perfectly silent, and perfectly empty, except for a single matte black table in the center. And sitting at that table with a small plate of tapas and a glass of chilled white wine was Salazar. He didn't look up from his food. He just checked his gold watch and sighed. "You're late, Marcus. I believe we agreed on 1 hour, and you've given me 3. I'm afraid the late fees are going to be substantial."